Hey, come on now. Don't cry. Don't cry. I know things are bad for you right now, and all you want is for everything to just fade away. But you know that won't happen. That's not how the world works. You always were a crybaby, and I know it's your only real way to cope with things, but you have to stop. Do you remember when Mum and Dad asked you what you wanted for your birthday? More than anything in the world when you were 8? And what did you want? A puppy. Your parents didn't think it was a good idea, so you cried and cried for almost a week. And on your birthday, what was their gift? A bicycle. So you cried and cried until you heard some little barks, and then you saw her running from the kitchen. She was little and yellow and so happy to be around you. What did you call her? That's right. You called her Matilda. The next couple of months flew by so fast, didn't they? Mum and Dad started to argue, but you didn't care. You had Matilda, and that was all that really mattered. But one morning, you woke up and Matilda wasn't there, was she? So you told your parents, and they immediately went looking for her, asking for you to trust them. And you cried, until a few days later, they found her in a ditch, and you cried and cried, until well after a week after you buried her, and you never wanted a puppy again. Do you remember a couple of years later, when Daddy came to see you after the divorce, that he took you to see his new girlfriend? All the rage you felt, all the loneliness, all the deep feelings of losing something very important to you? Do you remember when you asked your mum what you should do? In her drunken candor, saying that death is the only time loss counts, as keeping someone or something like Matilda. You spent your time in your room, crying your eyes out again. The next night, you were staying with your father when his girlfriend tried to make nice, but she talked to your father like you were some kind of freak. She won't open up to me, she said. She won't trust me, and I wish she would, and you cried yourself to sleep that night. And the next morning, your father screamed coming from the bathroom, and you ran into him, and all the blood that was all over the bathroom floor, her body in a bathtub, alcohol and pills everywhere, her slit wrist limply hanging over the side. The shock must have been too much, because you didn't cry after that. In fact, at the funeral you didn't cry. In fact, you seemed at ease about it. One could say that you were even happy about her death. To be honest, it was quite a while before you cried again. High school, I believe. Do you remember him? Johnny Whitmiller? He was such a nice kid. Football player, handsome, hard-working, had bought his own car by the age of 16. He was such a catch. You'd say you were the opposite. Shy, so reserved about everything, no friends to speak of. So alone, but out of the blue, he asked you to prom, and everyone was so shocked. Here he was, the big man on campus, and he wanted to go off as some nobody wallflower instead of the captain of the cheerleaders. Word spread quickly, then the rumours moved faster, didn't they? Slut, pity case, skank, wannabe welfare queen, trailer trash, cat lady. That one was the most preposterous. You don't really like animals now, do you? All these mean, hateful little words used to kill you from the inside out. You didn't outwardly cry, but everyone could see you wanted to. So they got worse, eventually moving to slapping you, abusing you, holding you down and cutting your hair, forcing you to wear gaudy makeup, and the teachers? They never lifted a finger. They didn't really care, considering most of the kids doing it to you were theirs. So you put up with it. But prom is where everything went to hell for you, didn't it? You were so pretty. You actually spent time taking care of yourself, and you paid attention to what was fashionable. And your nice, white dress, it looked like a wedding dress. Anyone could see that you would have been the most beautiful bride in the world. And Johnny was so handsome in his suit, perfectly tailored, looking like a model. The red corsage you placed on your white glove was so nice, the perfect splash of colour. He really was your Prince Charming, wasn't he? The event itself wasn't that spectacular, but you didn't care. Johnny was there, and he did everything correct. He said all the right things. He hadn't even noticed they were getting ready for the coronation of the prom queen and king until one of the cheerleaders reminded everybody of the nominees. You were shocked when you were announced as one of the candidates, and when it came to the announcement of who the queen was, you were even more surprised that you had won. Everybody cheered for you when you walked on stage, tears streaming down your face, your delicate makeup running slightly. But that happiness was short-lived. One of the cheerleaders announced that they had a special video and pulled down a screen and a projection started playing. A video of some nameless cheerleader and Johnny having sex. She egged him on, asking him why he was taking you to prom. Your tears wouldn't stop when he said he didn't care about you, how he was only using you. You were there for his amusement, and then you would be thrown away. He tried to tell you otherwise, but you ran away. And you ran. Falling down, messing up your dress, you broke the heels of your shoes, but you just threw them away and continued running home. Mum tried to ask you what happened, but you ran to your room, locked the door and cried for days afterward. There were even days when you woke up, cried, then went back to bed. That's how much it hurt. Do you remember what I said then? I said it'd make the pain, and all the things associated with it go away. You just had to trust me. Do you remember how Johnny died? How drunken with some girl all over him, he rolled his car into a ravine and killed them both? That's not necessarily my fault, but the alcohol was. You remember your daddy's girlfriend? Well, not the alcohol and pills, but the wrists were mine. As for Matilda, I felt I would lose you if you learned about responsibility. I couldn't have that, just like I can't have you crying right now. Shh, shh. Don't cry, alright? Just let the feeling wash over you. Just relax. It's just something in your milk I put in for you, so please don't cry, okay? You know I don't want to see you cry, just like I don't want to lose you. Mummy doesn't want to lose her precious, delicate little girl. The average businessman wouldn't usually come across an event like this in his entire life. But I, however, have experienced the strangest sequence of events the past few days. I know this is going to sound crazy. I know no one will believe me. But it's good for me to tell you, the viewer, about my spiral to insanity. I only knew about the Happiness Foundation in 1999, when I was still young and sane. I worked a stable job every day at Citibank, working long hours to keep up the income so I could save enough to care for my child, Caroline. I had a loving wife at home who would stay at our apartment to make sure everything was nice and orderly. We lived in an apartment in New York City, an expensive but beneficial location. Everything I said above is going to change in a matter of 3 weeks. Because of my location so close to home, I would usually just walk there. Buses would get me to the same area in the same amount of time with excess cost, and same for cars. Me and my wife don't go travelling much either, so we just stick with walking the whole way to wherever we want. However, every day I would face the same problem. The streets were cluttered with random people scatting around like pigeons, constantly irritating me when I went to work. For the sake of describing how frustrated I was, I'll put it this way. I could have torn apart a few people there, maybe 2 or 3 whenever I got blocked on the streets. This was probably the reason why I saw the flyers. One day on my way to work, I'd stopped to wait in a humongous crowd towering in front of me. Just then, I'd noticed a flyer that was quite disturbing when I thought about it, but also strangely enjoyable. There are too many people walking around these days. You can change that, one person at a time. The Happiness Foundation. It perfectly described my pain, but it could have been interpreted in a different light. Of course, you could already guess what I mean. Something felt off about this flyer, mostly because it had no true purpose to it. No one seemed bothered by the crowds in the street, nor could anyone change that. The other interpretation seemed to make a little bit more sense now. Then again, what was the Happiness Foundation? I never heard of them until now, which felt odd to me. Maybe they were a business who needed some help or just some attention seekers. I arrived at work and decided to forget about it. But then again, I should have asked someone. Maybe someone happened to know the answer. The next day, I had realized there were less people on the streets. Significantly less. That's it, I'm calling the police. As far as I knew, it wasn't a holiday or a day that statistics show to have less work days, so I might have been in the right there. But then again, it could have been coincidence, so I guess I was in the wrong. The police came over to the street where I'd seen the flyer, where the flyer still remained. They told me that there had been no murders yesterday, not that anyone had yet been notified of. So I moved on with my day. The next day had confirmed some suspicions of mine. Because of the little amount of people walking on the streets that day, I had extra time to stop by the coffee shop to get a latte. One sip had burnt my tongue, and as soon as that happened I cursed into the air. I cursed the man who made my latte so scorching hot. I should not have been such a whiny baby about it. Then I noticed the lamppost again to see a new flyer from the Happiness Foundation. The coffee's too hot? Just stop. The Happiness Foundation. Oh no. The next day, the coffee man was gone. The manager had stated that he quit the job. I tried to be careful about what I complained about, but I couldn't control it. I screamed at my co-worker Bradley for filing the papers incorrectly. I'm very inflammable, so I can get angry easily. I decided for the day that I keep my frustration written in a journal so I don't have to scream it. It worked very well. Whatever the Happiness Foundation needed for another excuse to kill, it's going to be hidden only for me to see. A to see you, dumbass. The Happiness Foundation. I left the journal at home. Big mistake. Bradley didn't show up to work today. I predicted that was going to happen because the world decides to work that way. Nothing upset me today, but for some reason the flyers changed today. After a close examination, it subtly described everything I was angry at yesterday. Shut up and keep working. The Happiness Foundation. Stop spamming. That's an order. The Happiness Foundation. So many people are unlikable these days. You can change that, one person at a time. The Happiness Foundation. And so on. But all of that was written in my journal, so that means someone had found my book. I ran home that day, went up to my apartment and almost fainted when I saw my book, wide open, close to an open window. A paperweight had stopped the pages from flowing out of order, sitting on one of the first pages in my journal. My wife was working in the same room. She was supposed to be taking care of the house, but she probably just sat there while a robber was sneaking in. I got so angry at her I couldn't believe that I had just unintentionally committed murder. I couldn't even control my anger for even a second before I started screaming right into her ears. I know she didn't understand how important that journal was, nor did she seem to realise that anyone had snuck in. But in reality, she should have. Now half my colleagues are dead. Upon closer examination, the journal had red circles around the names of people and the actions they committed that made me angry. It's clear that this so-called Happiness Foundation wants to help me somehow, but not in the way I wanted them to. They're targeting some of my closest friends here, and I'm the carrier for that kill order. I tried going off to sleep soundly that night. I couldn't. My baby, Charlotte, decided to start wailing when I was drifting off to sleep. Shut up, Charlotte. The next day, there was literally no one in the cubicles around me. It was actually fine for a while. Some of them were really annoying. But then I realized that they're all dead. And murdered by me. The daily paper mentioned nothing about any disappearances, let alone any murders. I'd come home early to try calming myself down, hoping that I'd get some joy from my wife and child. They weren't there. They weren't home. And I knew exactly why. I'm leaving. The day after that day, I flew to Russia, my homeland, to live there for the rest of my life. I hoped that they'd stop following me, stop ruining my life for a change. Sure, I knew little of the language, but I could make money just by washing clothing. I can live there forever, in safety. I can't be bothered here. Another flyer. I was at the laundromat and got a little frustrated with the new currency. They found me. They're stalking me once more. Pruska valuta переоценена. Fond gesture. I knew enough Russian to figure that one out. Fuck this, I hate you. I'm living in my shack and I will never leave. I don't want to kill anyone. I don't want to hurt anyone. If you, in particular, are reading this, leave me be. If you read this, you'll think I'm crazy. I'm not. I can't deal with this anymore. Goodbye, cruel world. I'm not happy. During the period of 1999, suicide rates in the US have gone up significantly. Although this might have been a coincidence, it is no doubt that the cause of this wasn't murder. This journal has been found in a pile of papers jumbled into an unorganized pile. The papers are in Russian writing, each one in the same formatting. Insert message here. Fond gesture. means Happiness Foundation in Russian. The body had been found, hanging from a noose in the cellar of the house which the resident had lived in. One flyer in particular states this: Yuratom Yoroft on Minaris Rojal Fond Gieste. My summer break had finally arrived, and it was filled with many joys. One of the great thrills it held was a very energetic and lovable kitten, who I enjoyed playing with immensely. Unfortunately, the kitten wasn't mine, and instead he belonged to my roommate, or ex-roommate should I say. He was the one who offered me a place to stay after the college dorms had kicked all the students out at spring semester's end. His name was Hobbs, and he was 9 months old, although I wouldn't have known at first glance that this monstrous cat was only a mere 8 months in age when I first moved in. He had white fur all over with auburn patches that swelled around, and black innocent babbles for eyes with a curious and dazzled expression on his face. It felt just like there was a small child in the apartment, and when I'd pet him or he'd follow me around, his gaze and body movements resembled a young child's playfulness and shy uncertainty of the world. He hung to my coattails to be guided, supported, fed and cared for. His rightful owner, Andrew, now lived with his girlfriend, but Hobbs remained behind. I questioned this move, but each time I pressed my roommate, he simply replied, "I'm sorry, I simply have nowhere else to put him," and that was the most I would get out of his reasoning. I even recommended that Andrew looked into finding some alternative if any existed, like in loving company of other family members that lived far away, so that the option of Hobbs remaining at the apartment could be a last resort. Don't get me wrong, I'm very attached to Hobbs as he is to me, but as I mentioned, I'm not the rightful owner. But alas, Hobbs remained behind, and I evidently had been granted full custody. The end of the month arrived once again, and it was time to collect my roommate Louise's money and put it in with mine so the rent could be paid. There was an ATM where I could deposit the money on campus and have it with my account to pay rent by the next morning. The ATM machine was a good 25 to 30 minute walk from my apartment. With the checks in hand, I gathered my belongings and prepared to make somewhat of a lengthy trek. Hobbs, who I now adored despite the times he had woken me early in the morning yearning for human affection, meowed frantically and ran in the usual circles around me. He then motioned slowly toward the door and sat with his round, white furry belly bunched up around his hind legs. Hobbs wished to be let outside, which was exactly where I was heading. It was not unusual for me to let the kitten outside for hours at a time, for it was obvious he knew where his home was and never wandered far from the front door, weary of anything else that moved outside the apartment. I cracked the door and the kitten squeezed through, beyond my control to keep him from getting out. Not like I wished to restrain such actions. I closed the door behind us, and once I had gone more than a few paces beyond the steps, I looked over my shoulder to see the kitten perched by the oak tree, sitting in his usual sturdy upward posture, observing me fall from sight. I reached the busy street bordering the university and crossed the curvy road on campus through the luring bike path running adjacent to the arboretum, which was a warming and comforting sight even in the dark of night. I didn't check the time before I left the apartment, though I knew it was evening. The colour from the sky had almost completely faded. Beyond the first few fancy lampposts, I noticed I was walking into complete darkness, and every light beyond it was off. I found this quite odd. I had walked down this bike path countless times before, and oftentimes at night, and before tonight, it was always perfectly well lit. I will admit, the dark makes me a little uneasy, but I have no major phobias for it, so I decided to keep walking on this path as normal, temporarily leaving behind the light of civilization. The bike path arched around for a little while, and eventually when I looked back, I found myself surrounded by darkness, but I could still make out the various overgrowths and tall trees leaning over the fence. I still felt a small level of comfort, but the tense feeling of unease was rising inside me. I began to feel like someone or something was approaching me, but when I turned around, I could only see blackness and no noticeable movement. A few more paces towards my destination I heard it, but it was very faint. The sound seemed far away, but was certainly coming from behind me. I froze, and without turning around, I heard it again, a cat's meow. I felt chills. It was very odd because I had never encountered a single cat on this bike path. Not only that, this particular cat seemed to be following me, coming straight away. and I could not tell for exactly how long it had been doing so, but aside from even that, the main reason that I felt so chilled was that it sounded exactly like Hobbs, in the same manner a frantic cry for attention. I heard it again, coming closer towards me. I finally spun around and squinted in the bleak darkness. I could make out a small silhouette that was drawing nearer, but it wasn't close enough yet. When it finally came within arm's length, I could see from its immature bodily and facial features that it was in fact a mere child, a kitten, while also the same as a full-grown cat. And there was that same expression on its face, curious and dazzled, with two black innocent babbles for eyes. Its fur was brighter than the colours around it, with the same swirly patch of dark fur. I doubted that this could be Hobbs, who had followed me all the way from the apartment, as I wouldn't deem impossible of such a thing without sooner being hit by a car, but the resemblances were eerily similar. As I looked down on this kitten, I simply stared at its face peering back at mine, those two black baubles acknowledging my gaze. I didn't dare pet it as I didn't know the kitten at all, and found myself suddenly losing interest and turning away. As I did, the kitten ran in front of me towards a grassy patch of land hardly still within sight by the fence, and clawed and nibbled on a few weeds, beginning to chomp away. After a lengthy pause, I finally began heading in the same direction as I had been this whole time. Still feeling a bit creeped out, but I decided that the kitten's resemblance was only a mere coincidence. I felt curiosity growing on me, and finally it got the better of me. I just had to go back over by that fence to get a second look at it. To my dismay, I saw no movement, and I was sure I was looking in the general direction of where the kitten was. As I'd backtracked, I confirmed the kitten had in fact entirely disappeared without a trace. It had probably climbed over the fence without me hearing it, or sprinted away quickly into the heavy darkness, but I still wished that I would have caught sight of that kitten one last time. I finally reached the main part of the campus by the bookstore, student centre and library, where the ATM was waiting for me. Between the main gym area and the path leading to the ATM machines, a few young feminine bodies emerged from behind the corner of the pool and were suddenly right in front of my face. I was taken aback in surprise, but what made me feel particularly creeped out was that eerie silence as they stepped solemnly one foot in front of the other, with not even a hint of response from the cement when their shoes made contact. A few became many, proving the first woman I saw to be the mere frontrunner of a long line of them. The cement still made no sound. These women were all draped in black dresses, similar to what you'd wear to a funeral, and seemed all to be about high school age. Their expressions were mostly blank and seemed pale, and what I found to be particularly odd is that not a single one of them even acknowledged my presence, even though I stood only a few feet away from them. Even this was distancing myself from the position that I had first encountered the figuration of ladies. I suddenly felt quite invisible as I noticed a uniform emotionless expression on them, with those same downward angled eyes staring at the ground as they solemnly trekked on. I took a few more steps back slowly, noticing how I could audibly make out the sound of my steps immediately, while the tens of bodies that had just intersected my path mere seconds ago were deadly silent. They continued to follow a straight path right past a small gym in the distance now, and I could not make out where the front of the line was anymore from where I was standing. I couldn't imagine what their purpose was being on campus. I mean, from their formation and odd silent behaviour. Anytime I'd seen groups of people from a high school age group, it was clear they were either attending sports, taking a tour exploring the campus, or celebrating an event. I could only assume that these women, that they were rehearsing for some kind of weird act or play, but whatever they were in fact doing, they seemed very serious. And all of those steps with the sound turned completely off, like watching a silent movie. I couldn't make any sense of it. I slapped my face on both cheeks to confirm I was still real and shook off my second spook of the night. At last I arrived at the ATM machine and very quickly sealed the envelope with the deposit amount I needed. The exchange was successful, and my one chore for the night was now complete. I could now turn back and begin my long trek back to the complex. As I made my first crossing past Student Centre, I was amazed to see a homeless person standing there. My body actually jolted back in shock, for I had not been more than a few steps away from this person before I even knew he existed. The homeless man did not even acknowledge my surprise, and stared blankly in my general direction. I responded by keeping my eyes straight forward and trying my best not to appear alarmed. My heart was still pounding out of my chest. "The cat," I heard the homeless man mutter under his breath. I felt my eyes widen a little when I heard it, but I still did my best not to acknowledge the man. "The cat," I heard faintly once again. I had made it a few paces past him, at which point I began to power walk. I did not take the bike path again, and decided I'd instead take a different scenic route back to my destination through the on-campus dorms. I'd realised that I'd not seen a single rabbit the entire time I'd been walking on campus, which was bizarre. I'd always see at least a few before tonight, and by these dorms most of all, but even here nothing. Totally dead. But of course nothing this night was occurring as it ordinarily should, so I was beginning to expect the unexpected, and as I did, the unexpected kept happening. I was on the other end of the arboretum now, on the opposite adjacent fence, and once again there was a cat in the distance. It was well lit this time, and it was clearly an all-black cat, and its eyes reflected the light at the same fancy lampposts like glass as it watched my approach. This time, I couldn't even get near the cat before it fled, and each time it would stop after a short distance then darted off again and again, peering back at me as I progressed at my normal pace, perhaps slightly faster than my normal pace. I'd realised that I'd not taken my gaze off it for a while, and when I did, I began to notice that I was surrounded by more black cats. They were not drawing any closer to me, and they didn't seem curious about my presence. They just watched, as if they'd expected to see me. If I even tried to take a few steps towards any of them, they would dart away, and I knew I'd never catch any of them. Stranger still, each black cat appeared to be an exact replica of the other, like cat quadruplets, quintuplets, sextuplets. Then I saw something that triggered me to panic. A dead rabbit. It didn't appear that it was eaten, because there was no evidence of guts or torn ligaments, or at least from what its backside revealed. The rabbit was just motionless and limp, and I couldn't see its face. It didn't appear as if it even struggled before it died. I could smell that grotesque stench from where I was staring at it, trying to understand the hideous sight revealed before my eyes. I know it's silly to say I was afraid of a dead rabbit, but I felt on edge. These black cats staring directly at me. It hindered me and made me feel all too vulnerable. I suddenly bolted out of there. I did not even stop to think about what I was doing. I just ran. As I did this, I saw another dead rabbit, and I focused my eyes straight ahead of me without moving another muscle in my neck another centimetre, refusing to observe any more murdered or deceased animals that were being laid before my feet. I was unsure of which of the two it was. The black sextuplets dispersed as I ran as if for dear life towards the students' parking structure. I felt like a coward and gathered myself together. I refocused my bearings. I remembered to breathe, and suddenly I wanted to get back home so badly now. I was just so creeped out by what I had seen thus far tonight. I wished I could at the very least see one student walking about in the dorms so I could share my experiences with them and get it off my chest. But there was no one. Suddenly, I squinted through the narrow alleyway between the back of the Doubles dorm building and parking structure. "What the hell?" I said aloud, looking on. My body became a statue. What I saw were the same configuration of girls in their dark outfits from before. It was unquestionably the same girls I saw when I was near the ATM. A part of me felt curious and wanted to walk through the alleyway to see if they would talk to me, but another side of me, the part I listened to, told me to take the long way around through the parking structure. I hurried before the girls could beat me to the windy road bordering the freeway, and as I crossed the street into the sawdust and elm trees opposite the fence, I could not resist a glance at the face of one of the girls in the line formation. I could see from this viewpoint that each of the girls had a cold, lifeless expression on their face, and was staring down at the same level as my feet were. I swallowed my own spit, and realised the fact that I was craving a meal was not helping the situation. Not a single one of the girls, and I mean no one, even glanced up at me one time, and the overwhelming sense of being invisible I felt from earlier told me that these people would take no notice of me if I just bolted away from them up the curvy path ahead, which is exactly what I did, slipping back into the darkness of the night. I also confirmed what my ears could not tell me earlier when I was a mere feet away from them, and from the soft chirping of crickets that were more audible, I could tell that their steps made no echo into the night. But it was still unexplainable, especially for such a large crowd motioning forward ever slowly. Their feet would give some hint that they were walking and not floating. And they weren't floating, they were walking. And I just didn't want to think about it. I didn't even look back this time, and I began wondering what else could possibly scare me, lurking on ahead and waiting for me in the shadows of obscurity. Even with the mysterious line of female figures not far behind me, I couldn't shake the images of what I'd seen before from my psyche. They were now burned into my memory. Even the encounter with the kitten that had appeared to be almost a clone of Hobbs on the bike path. Trying to erase these images from my head would prove difficult. I suddenly realised as my mind was racing that there was in fact something else that I found rather unsettling, which was that the freeway I was right next to seemed eerily quiet. A wall running along the freeway blocked my view of the passing cars, and each time I progressed about 10-15 steps, the windy sound of cars passing in the opposite direction of the freeway would gradually decrease in volume. Even though this freeway followed closely to the wall that separated it from the path, I was still practically right next to the freeway before the concave road became more twisted, seemingly more than I remembered. As I progressed, hoping to see the straightaway soon enough, the road only became more concave and more twisted still. It seemed as if the bend in the road was copying itself multiple times over, and I got an alarming sense of deja vu. I peeked behind me and the girl formation line was covered from view behind the curved fence, as it had been for a while now. It felt as if the path should have taken me in full circle by now, and I felt incredibly uneasy as the only thing I saw behind and in front of me was seemingly an endless bend. What in the hell was going on? Where was the straightaway? At last, I let out a sigh of relief as the straightaway finally appeared in view. Perhaps I'd been walking slower than I thought, perhaps out of fear, hunger, and paranoia that was getting the best of me by now. I almost thought I'd find myself surrounded by black cats before I saw a straight path again, and the immense relief I felt overpowered the eerie feeling I dreaded just a little while before, and I felt a smile etched on my face. Man, what a creepy night this has been. My relief, however, proved to be short-lived, as another realization occurred to me. Where are all the cars? I'd not seen a single moving vehicle in at least the last few miles. I'd only seen parked cars. The clearing past the oak trees and sawdust trail revealed the same street as before I'd made my way onto the campus, except what the hell? The road was now completely void of moving vehicles and was dead silent. It was supposed to be a busy street and it couldn't have been much later than 9 PM by now, yet the street was clear except for two bodies standing stationary at the turning lane. At this point, not too far from returning from my place of hearth now, my mindset about these seemingly unnatural occurrences radically changed. Could I be dreaming? Or had I somehow entered another dimension or parallel universe? The thought seemed preposterous, of course. But just what the hell was this? I felt like the world was pulling a big prank on me, and it just seemed too realistic to be a dream. I could feel cold sweat on every inch of my body, especially my back and forehead, and the warm night air felt hot against my cheeks. I felt more sweat trickling down my brow, and I could feel my heart pounding, but my sprinting from before probably contributed to this cold sweat more than anything else. I shook off these thoughts for but a moment, and I had only taken a few steps up the hill that led to the bridge over the freeway when I decided that the two people standing motionless in the middle of the street were just bothering me too much. Even though there was still a chance of being spooked, I had to assure myself that these people were the first normal people that I would encounter tonight. As it turns out, I was wrong. I had to shake off the realization that there were no cars coming on either side of this normally busy street as I walked up to these people. I felt a small amount of relief again as I noticed that these two seemed to have a conscience like me, and actually acknowledged my presence. However, one of these two people still had his arm up and was pointing at something off in the distance, and I also noticed that his arm was motionless, yet they still did not speak to me, but simply nodded when we exchanged glances. They were two young men and had buzz cuts. One was a good 6 inches taller than the other in height. both men wearing clean hoodies and jeans, nothing too out of the ordinary here. The shorter man kept his arm up even as he kept his head tilted towards my direction. After a short frame of silence, still neither one spoke a single word to me, only to each other. "Hey man, I think it's still over there, do you see it?" The shorter man was almost whispering, pointing at the opposite end of the street leading to the university apartments. "How can you see it? I don't see anything. Don't you see where I'm pointing? They're still over there. I don't know what's happening." By this time, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided that I must make one final stop before heading back to my apartment, and I braced myself for what lay waiting for me at the opposite end of this street. One of my friends lived in this complex, so I figured if this little adventure ended out of nowhere, that I could at least stop by his apartment if he was there. Perhaps we could even hang out then, and I could finally share my tale with someone. The road reached the gate and I saw nothing at all, so I shrugged and decided to let myself through the gate into the university apartment complex. I just needed to speak with somebody about my weird night, and my roommate would certainly be getting ready for bed in order to wake up early for work by the time I got back there. At least I knew my friend would still be awake. I was barely inside the complex when I caught something moving in my peripherals, in the direction of where the short man had been pointing. I caught an image of a shadow slowly vanishing behind the back of one of the apartment buildings, but I was confused that what I saw appeared so dark, considering how well lit the area around it was. Behind me, the road was still silent, and I was fed up trying to discern any logic from earlier events. I wanted to hurry over and examine the area of my little sighting, but I noticed instead that the tall pole in the centre of the courtyard seemed different. I remember joking to my friend about this tall pole because there were so many cameras attached to it, appearing to hold no purpose but to ruin people's privacy. I noticed the light illuminating it. It was dimmed and flickering, and I also noticed the cameras attached to the pole. The glass had been smashed. Every single camera on every side of the pole was broken, with glass pieces scattered around in brown and yellow grass. I made a big circle around the pole in case for my own safety, and I suddenly felt concerned for my friend's safety as well. I could hear something off in the distance, but very faintly. Perhaps there were people partying, having a good time. I could only hope. This complex was after all home mainly to the foreign exchange students of the university. I hurried over to my friend's apartment on the far end of the courtyard, and as I came near the front door, I discovered that it was in fact wide open, with one light in the kitchen illuminating the rest of the apartment. A lot of the other doors were open, either with or without lights on, while others remained closed with the blinds shut and no light laying beyond it. I ran inside his apartment, even though he would have no idea I was coming and that I felt on the verge of insanity. My friend's bedroom door was unlocked with the light on his laptop on, but he was nowhere to be found. That's when I heard it. Faintly off in the distance, the chanting. As I left the courtyard square, the voices drew closer and sounded more evil with every step. I still could not make out what a single person was saying. Just a few moments before, I'd thought I'd heard people having fun and socializing, but the tone now evidently appeared dark. I'd given up and I ran towards the noise, regardless of what could be waiting for me. I just needed something, someone to talk to before my head exploded. But through the labyrinth of more and more buildings, I was getting lost. My mind began wandering, trying desperately to fill myself with happier thoughts. I wonder if Hobbs is getting hungry by now, and just imagining lifting the kitten up playfully and squeezing it gently, saying that I missed him. As these thoughts flashed through my mind, I was instantly pulled out of my daydream by an agonizing, horrible high-pitched scream, piercing deep into my ear sockets. This terrifying, nightmarish sound insinuated a direct response to my thoughts, pulling me right back into the madness and taunting me. This cry did not belong to a human, but they were instead the distant wailing shrieks of a single creature. A cat. I ran in a zigzag around every barrier in my way, drawing closer and closer to the shrieks. The chanting became more haunting and aggressive, and there were no discernible words to be heard, all in some different language. More buildings, more buildings. I could only wince at the shrieking that ripped through my eardrums, but I needed to see so badly just what the hell was happening. I could only wonder what was left to the imagination. What could I possibly stumble upon next that was worse than the horrors the bleak night had already presented me? At last I came to a clearing, and I could not have prepared myself for what I saw. Those same black gowns, and there were black suits too, within the same emotionless expressions as the girls, walking in formation as I'd already seen twice before. But they were chanting now, joined with men as well. There was no sign of my friend, not like I would ever expect him to be a part of a cult, but expecting the unexpected had been working for me thus far. I'd figured out pretty quickly that I was right about the cries, and I covered my eardrums and went into the fetal position. My mind yelled at me, "Why did you have to bring yourself here? You know that you didn't want to see this. This will now scar me for life." Despite my vicious thoughts, another part of me, that other side to my psyche, forced me to look. And now I felt a slave to stare at the madness unfolding from a distance. In the center of the circular formation, by 4 tiny blood-spattered sakes, were 3 cats lying on the ground as lifeless corpses, drained of life from a single stab wound in the chest and covered in their own blood. There were also 4 cages with 3 cats inside, making none of the hissing noises I would expect in an attempt to defend themselves. Instead, they appeared to be sleeping next to a single fluorescent lamp, the type used to light a picnic table camping out in the woods. One cage stood empty, and a young woman stepped solemnly forward to the darkness to present a token, murmuring a chant pattern as the others near her took their turn to chant the same repeating unknown phrases. I apparently had a death wish, because at this moment, I felt compelled to halt her progress. I would march straight up there without a second thought, to get a close look at her face and see what she was holding. But wait, this isn't right. No, it can't possibly be. Hobbs? Hobbs! I nearly shouted, but the kitten did not turn toward me. It could not turn toward me. Like the cat in the cages, it had evidently been drugged and was motionless. The woman, or rather teenage girl, turned slowly towards me, presenting both her arms in the present they held. "Does this one belong to you?" Her voice sounded surprisingly normal, but it was lacking in natural speech patterns. "Yes, I mean, it has to be. The kitten looks too similar." But again, I could not know if my words held true. But everything about this kitten matched my image of Hobbs, with the same uncomfortable expression on its face, holding its eyes tightly closed, and at any moment I expected his eyes to open up. He felt the same too as I brushed my arm over him, with soft and fuzzy fur and the matching auburn swirly patterns over a white coat. The same white and auburn coloured face with a curious look upon his face, and even the lining of his mouth. It all matched, like a photographic copy. And then, after a few more movements, the kitten's eyes opened and saw me. I expected him to leap out the girl's arms and dash away before I could catch him. He didn't. And even more surprisingly, the kitten seemed to recognize me and batted my nose as I leaned into his paw, letting him sniff my face. That face. It was Hobbs. It could not have belonged to any other kitten. After I saw the kitten in his conscious state, I became overtaken by the thought of how the kitten that belonged to my ex-roommate Andrew could have possibly landed in this mysterious stranger's hands, and I lashed out at her in anger. "Have you lost your mind? You would have killed him while he was wide awake. How could you possibly do this to him?" The cultist girl had a rather unapologetic expression on her face, even ignoring my anger entirely. "He seems to take a liking to you. Are you his owner?" "No, I'm not. I take care of him," I said, with the kitten still patting my arms with a bewildered look on his face. I just wanted to snatch the poor soul out of the mysterious girl's arms and rush the hell out of there without turning back. But then suddenly, another unexpected move. The girl stepped slowly towards me and then leaned down as I held my arms out, and the kitten quickly scrambled out of her arms into mine. Now that I had him, I couldn't let him fall back into the girl's hands, and I stared into the girl's motionless face with the exact opposite expression. "No cat deserves to die in your pointless ritual." She was stirred by no attempt at reason, and what she said next perhaps shocked me more because of the hint of emotion it carried. "Such a shame. He needs a more deserving owner." I suddenly felt empowered by her answer, like I could actually rattle what little emotion she felt. Why the hell are you killing cats? What the hell is this? You and the rest of your people will answer for this, as to why I have to save the owner's kitten from this premature burial. I was drained, and began panicking from yelling for this brief period of time because I felt so strongly attached to my words. But the problem with these words is the amount of attention they drew from the crowd, to the extent I perhaps not wished it. I was now surrounded on all sides by at least a dozen curious faces. They were now blocking my exit like the cats in the ritual circle. Every emotionless face with the same uniform cold expression was just so infuriating. "Leave now," one of the boys in a suit bellowed at me. "You are disturbing the cycle, Tainted One. We do not require your presence," a younger girl told me. And this certainly disturbed me most of all. What in the hell was the cycle? My jaw dropped, and I lost all words that had come to my mind before now. I could only stare between two of the dark figures standing before me at the poor helpless cat in a cage that was about to be slaughtered. I knew in my mind that these cats were being slaughtered and not humans, but there was just something so incredibly unsettling about knowing that these creatures' lives were being cut short in such an awful way. In a way, I could relate it to myself. What would it look like for me? What would I feel? And with that thought, I could feel the temptation of my next thought, a scheme that was forming in my head, but I tried desperately to fight it. Why did I believe that I could rescue the cats in the cages at the risk of Hobbs' life? I was responsible for him, and I'd be making a terrible risk, and I'd probably be cornered by the disturbing figurines in human flesh, and they would eat my insides just like the rabbits. But no, that's not what happened to those rabbits. I never saw any guts. I couldn't possibly know that. I must be losing my mind, I remember telling myself, and I was visibly hitting myself on the head trying to wake up and slapping my cheeks, whatever it was in my power to do. I forgot about the kitten that was between my arms, and I pushed two of the figures in the circle out the way to chase the sprawling cat. They didn't fight me, they simply left me to my duties to chase the kitten down. Try as I might, I couldn't catch up with Hobbs as he faded into the darkness. Now it was just me and the chanting in the distance, growing louder, more aggressive, more evil. I prepared myself for the exact moment another blade met with the cat flesh, and the horrible howling cry as I covered my ears and listened to the sound of my heartbeat, racing as fast as it possibly could. "Wake up," I told myself. Still no sounds of cars in the distance. "Please, wake up." There was nothing but the noise of my chattering teeth and the sound of my panting with the screeching cries of dying cats, with the chanting growing to a roar in the background. It was closing in on me, that terrible sound, sucking me back into their ritual. Why did such a scream have to be so unbearable? I just couldn't take it that horrible noise growing even louder still, growing louder. It was beyond unbearable. Louder! I finally snapped, and I left Hobbs, or at least the kitten deemed to be his clone, in the shadows to rot in that place. I was running now, and I panicked when I finally realized that there were no cars. There were none, even at the next intersection and beyond off in the distance. When I finally came to the bridge over the freeway, my body became completely paralyzed. I could not move. I've never seen such an empty freeway before in my life. I'd seen empty busy roads such as these, sure, but not for nearly as such an extended period of time as this. Just to see the empty lanes as far as the eye could see towards the hills off in the distance, disappearing only over the curvature of the earth. Even in movies set in the zombie apocalypse, there would be hundreds and thousands of overturned cars in sight, and an obvious reason for it known. But this? Complete emptiness? It was just completely unexplainable to describe the emotion. There are simply no words for what it feels like to discover the impossible appeared to have invaded reality. It made as little sense as anything else I'd encountered that night, and from my viewpoint, I could see more parked cars over in the university shopping centre and on the streets. It was the creepiest feeling that I'd ever felt. Those parked cars told a different story as to what I knew to be true. Everything is normal. There is nothing wrong. It defied and twisted logic, just like the concave road appearing as to bend for all eternity. As I remained as solid as a statue, I knew that someone was standing behind me, but I just couldn't move. I couldn't take my eyes off the barren emptiness that lay beneath my feet, barren far into the distance toward a single vanishing point. It's too late now. You're trapped in this world, I heard a girl's voice tell me. You and the kitten will never leave this place. I struggled to turn and face her, but I still found myself in a stun lock. My body's muscles were not responding. I felt a sudden, unexplainable surge of warmth that extended up from my toes towards my head. It felt so peaceful. A relieving, soothing, powerful calm that enveloped me in such a way that I can only describe it as complete solitude. It felt as though I had accepted my fate with grace, but I was still paralyzed. Not a muscle in my body would move on command. You must come back, she urged me, and I was overcome with the need to yell again, but I knew I would not be able to muster a sound and gave up. I was in dismay. Is it possible she didn't know I was in a state of complete paralysis? Suddenly, my answer was revealed as I can hear a car engine fast approaching as it squalted to a halt behind me. A car door opened up, and I was hurled into the back seat by two of the ritual boys as my joints still did not budge. I was lobbed just like a statue. I had been reduced to an inanimate object. The car engine whirred and my eyes began flooding. I had not cried, albeit joy or sadness, in years. I was mesmerized by the tears, as they had no hot or coldness about them. I could simply not feel the tears. I could not tell what my emotion was right now. It was just all too confusing. Was I really here? Was I real? Were these ritualists real? Was the ritual even real? Was I ever in reality to begin with this night? Or if so, where did it all go so horribly wrong? I still felt solitude, but at once I felt an incredible force. A piercing headache that clawed into my brain, scrambling my thoughts, squeezing them. It juggled them around, beat them to a pulp, just like any act of bullying I could describe inflicted upon my head. It all came at once as quickly as receiving a splinter scraping your hand along the wood. It attacked me from the inside out. It felt as though the car ride was lasting for days, turning seconds into hours, warping the duration of time in ways that are impossible to visualize. I just felt so lost in it all. Still none of my joints would move, not even an inch, and I stared out the corner of my frozen eye sockets at a glimpse of the palm of my hand, hoping to give some definitive sign of movement. But I could no longer tell how long I had been frozen in this way, how long the night had lasted, or what day it was. But they were still in the car, those cultists, the driver and car zooming off into oblivion. I could see them in my peripherals. No one made a sound, and since I couldn't turn my head, I was pinned staring out the side window, watching the passing buildings, props, trees, light posts, trash cans. I couldn't differentiate them anymore. It was all one big sweeping blur. Because of how oblivious I was to time, I can't tell how long it took exactly, but eventually a non-existent force let me lay down, and for the briefest moment before I drifted to sleep, I swear I could feel something small and fuzzy nestle between the palms of my hands. We never arrived at our destination, or at least I don't think we did. To be honest, I still don't know where I am, or how I'm even typing this. You might be wondering then, how did you manage to write anything before this then? When did your paralysis leave you? What type of prank are you pulling on us? Where are you now? I was always bad at pulling pranks, and I was never the type that dared to dream. Doing something stupid instead, like steal a pencil away from my classmate's desk and watch them act baffled at its disappearance. But a prank like this? No. I would not imagine. I'm so shocked at everything I've told you that I'm now convinced it was all real, and in fact, not an act of my imagination. I'm not crazy, and my reality, my only reality, has been reduced to a blur and shadows, and yes, my paralysis faded off when I awoke, and it faded along with the world I left behind. If I stop for a long while, the kitten still follows me, although I refuse to still call the creature Hobbs. I still hear their chanting, but it's always off in the distance, so taking care of my roommate's cat is proving not to be much of a problem now. I never see the other cats anymore, only when I close my eyes. It often makes me stop and wonder what my roommate would be thinking of what has happened to me and where I am now. In quiet moments, I take a seat on the ground that smeared the canvas of the earth. I can see the convicting eyes of those black cats staring into me, fading away as I reopen my eyes. I try to keep my eyes open for long lengths of time, but eventually, I see them again, and it haunts me. My name is Graham. I'm living in hell, surrounded by devils. I've been an outcast since birth. My parents argue all the time, and when my dad isn't drunk and beating me up, it's usually mum that gives me all the beating. They put a poker face on in front of the police when they come due to noise complaints, which happened a lot. School isn't any better. I'm treated like crap at school, and the teachers don't do a goddamn thing about it. Out of all the problems I have, getting bullied was the worst, especially from them. Nick, Brandon and Kevin. Those three have beaten, mugged and called me names for as long as I can remember. We went from kindergarten all the way to the high school we are in now. Why haven't I transferred, you ask? Because, like I said above, my parents did not give a fuck about me. Even after I told them my problems multiple times, the school office got annoyed with my frequent visits, and I don't go there anymore since they don't want to deal with me. I'm scared to create any social pages right now because those three might torture me there. It was the same things repeated every day. Wake up, see parents who don't care, go to school, get bullied, come back, go home, be depressed about it. I always carried the pocket knife with me, and figured it was time to commit suicide and end all this. Until I met her. Her name was Samantha. She was the most beautiful girl I'd ever seen. She just transferred here and was assigned to the seat next to me. I thought she wouldn't want to talk to a loser like me, so I didn't talk to her at first, even though I wanted to really bad. But it turns out, she would be the one to talk to me first. "Hi, I'm Sam. What's your name?" she asked. That was the first time in many years someone talked to me that way. I couldn't believe what was happening. It's Graham, but you don't want to talk to me." What was I saying? Turning down an opportunity like that? "Why not? I don't know anyone, and I want to start with you," she replied. And so, we became really close after that. We ate lunches together, told jokes, shared stories, studied for tests, and much more. She was the first one. She was the first one to reach out to me. Every now and then I caught myself tearing up. Was this reality? Was it in a dream? I pinched myself to check. She's always there beside me, smiling. We became more than friends. We loved each other. But she was the only good thing about my life. I was still getting bullied and beaten up by those three, Nick, Brandon and Kevin. It was another day of beating. They were kicking me down to the ground. I curled up trying to ease the pain that wouldn't go away. "There they are, officer! Get them!" I heard a shout from a familiar voice. It was no doubt Samantha. I heard footsteps running, eventually fading into a distance. I saw Sam's hand reaching out for me. I grabbed it and she helped me to stand on my feet. "Pieces of shit. Picking on someone as a group. It's not right," she said angrily. "Look, Sam, I know what you're trying to do," I said. "But you shouldn't get involved. I don't want to see you hurt." "I don't care, Graham. I love you, and I want to protect you," she said. And protect she did. Every time I was getting picked on or beaten up, she always came to my rescue. I honestly thought she was an angel sent to make my life better. A couple of days later, I was getting beaten up again. It was more vicious this time. They were kicking, punching, batting, and pulverizing me. "Stop that!" I heard Sam from somewhere. "Oh look, if it isn't Joan of Arc coming to the rescue," said Nick. "Stop this right now, or I'll call the police on you guys again," Sam yelled. "No you won't," replied Nick mockingly. I heard sets of movements grabbing her. I wanted to get up, but I couldn't. The pain was just too much. "Let go of me," she said, with a little fear in her voice. "We're tired of you, bitch, interrupting our little fun. We're gonna teach you a lesson you won't forget, Nick said, with an evil chuckle. My eyes weren't opening from the bruises. I heard Sam crying while Nick grunting and breathing heavily. Brandon and Kevin were smirking from what I heard. After about 10 minutes, I heard Nick stop grunting. Did you guys get all of that? Yeah, we got it on camera, said Brandon. Piece of shit. We wanted a turn. We were holding back really bad. Doesn't matter now, said Nick. We got the blackmail. Celestia are trying to stop us now. I heard them walking away with laughter. I could finally open my eyes now. I saw Sam crying in the corner. I got all my strength together to walk over to her. I got her in my arms. We cried together in that corner for as long as I could remember. I felt really bad and sorry for her to get hurt like that. We got up and walked home together since our houses weren't that far from each other. At the point where we had to split, we said our farewells. Sam, I'm here for you. Always remember that, I told her while holding her hands. Okay, she replied very weakly. I saw her getting farther and farther away from me. Then she turned the corner and was out of my sight. The next day, the school was in an unusual mood. Like something happened. Then there was the morning announcement. Students, we have grave news. Our friend, Samantha Helens, has committed suicide. What did I just hear? She's dead? Gone? Forever? One of the girls was whispering to another. I heard she did it because she was trying to help that loser over there. It was my fault. I brought her into my life. I was the reason she died. I was in agony all day at school. On my way home, Nick came up to me. Aw, are you hurt because she was the only way you could stand up? Did you enjoy it while I fucked your girl? I was finally at my limit. I took out my pocket knife and before he could react, I slit his throat. He fell on the ground and gagged. I took the cell phone out of his pocket and called Brandon. Yo Nick, where are you? Said Brandon over the phone. We've been waiting here for 5 minutes. Nick? Oh, he's here alright. He's bleeding out next to me, I told him. How did you get his phone and what the fuck are you talking about? Said Brandon. I suggest you come here to find out. He's losing a lot of blood. I hung up the phone and crushed its smithereens. When they get here, I'll make them join Nick. I finally understood. Why couldn't I see this before? If I couldn't endure the tortures from the devils, all I needed to do was become the devil himself. Thanks, Samantha. You showed me exactly what I needed to do. I will bear my claws into all of those who have wronged me. All in your name. Jacob cursed as he pushed through the thick underbrush trying to make his way to the tree stand he had built earlier in the summer. He was certain this location would give him an optimal line of sight to the neighbouring field in which he frequently saw large herds of deer. This was going to be his year, and he was sure of it. This is the year that I bring home my trophy buck, he thought, as he recalled the events of the day so far. He had awakened at 4:30 AM. He began to prepare for a long day in the woods on the back side of his farm. His first order of business had been to locate and rescue his gloves and camouflaged hunting gear from whatever undisclosed area of his home that his wife had hidden them. He would most assuredly need them this morning to protect him from the bitter cold of November morning. How could it be this cold this early in the year, he wondered, as he started to work on his second task of the day, which was to prepare a breakfast that would stick to his ribs long into the day. He wasn't entirely sure what he wanted this morning, but he finally settled on toast, country ham and scrambled eggs that were just a little too runny. He topped it all off with a large cup of coffee that had left a bitter aftertaste on his tongue. In fact, he could still taste it. After accomplishing tasks 1 and 2, he packed himself a bologna and cheese sandwich for lunch, grabbed his Remington 30.6 hunting rifle, a thermos of coffee, and headed out the door. He loaded his gear into his truck and pulled out of the driveway and turned right onto the 1-lane blacktop road that led to the backside of his property. After about 2¼ miles, he turned right again off the blacktop onto a dirt road that was gouged deep with mud-filled ruts. He had to travel about half a mile down that pitfall rut-filled excuse for a road when he came to his desired location. He got out of his truck and loaded his gun and sauntered off into the woods. Jacob had gone little more than 500 yards into the densely wooded tree line when he began to wish that he had put on an extra layer of clothing to shield him from the chilly morning air. 10 minutes out of the truck and he was already cold, and it was made worse by the cloudy overcast day and the wind that was blowing steadily through the trees, making the autumn leaves rattle like dry bones. Oh well, he thought. It's going to be a good day anyway, especially if I bring home a big one. Jacob took about 10 more steps when an uneasy feeling began to creep over him. He felt as though someone had stepped over his grave. He got a distinct feeling that he was being watched, but by whom? This was his property, and it was posted that no one had permission to be on his land. He had to be alone. But if he was alone, why couldn't he shake this eerie feeling that was scratching at the base of his skull? Something was off today. There was a deafening silence there in the forest. No bird, no insects, only the sound of the wind in the trees. Convincing himself that there was nothing more than a case of nerves, he continued to press on until he came to a clearing not far from his tree stand. Stepping into the clearing, Jacob saw the remains of what appeared to be a large deer. He wasn't quite able to make out what he was seeing from this distance because the sun wasn't completely up yet and the forest was still enveloped in shadows. Jacob walked closer to get a better look, and he found that he had been correct. It was a deer. A large 8-point buck, in fact. Looking at the remains, he felt a sense of dread come over him and icy fingers danced along his spine. Something about this kill just didn't seem right. The throat was completely torn out, and the stomach was ripped open, plus several of the internal organs were missing. It was the most grisly thing he had ever seen. This definitely wasn't a coyote kill, and no hunter would have done this. They would have taken the head to have it mounted. What could have done this, he wondered. A fear like nothing he had ever experienced before began to wash over him in waves. What's going on, he thought. At nearly 225 pounds and well over 6 foot, he wasn't one to give in to fear, but now he couldn't seem to calm down, and his heart was beating like a trip hammer. Feeling that he was being watched was getting stronger by the minute, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was moments away from a bad situation. He slowly started to back away from the mangled carcass and head back to his truck and back to safety. No more than 6 steps into his journey, his blood turned to ice in his veins as a deep guttural wailing scream shattered the eerie silence and what was left of his courage. He had grown up on the farm all his life and had been an experienced hunter since childhood. He was familiar with every animal in this part of the state. Not even a cougar, bobcat or bear could have produced the scream that had torn through the early morning forest and filled him with such bone-chilling apprehension. Primal fear now gave way to stark terror as he chambered around into his 30.6 and turned it around only to find there was nothing behind him. His mind raced with confusion as he was confronted with a million thoughts at once. What should I do? What could it be? Should I run? Am I going to die? His survival sense kicking into overdrive, Jacob decided to continue on his previously contrived plan, which was to go to the truck and get out of there while the getting was good. Slowly and cautiously, he made his way towards the perceived salvation of his vehicle, silently praying every step of the way. With 300 yards separating him and his only avenue of escape, Jacob began to hear heavy footfalls on his left. He could hear the crunching of withered leaves, sticks and debris that littered the forest floor. Summoning every ounce of courage that remained within him, he forced himself to look in that direction, and that is when he saw the dark silhouette that followed him through the densely tangled forest. Quickening his pace, he redoubled his efforts to reach the truck and get to a phone and call the sheriff, the game warden or anyone who would listen. He couldn't tell what it was that was stalking him, but he could clearly see that it towered more than 7 feet and was incredibly massive. Jacob couldn't help but think that he was about to become a national statistic. A person who left home under normal circumstances and just disappeared without a trace. How many people, he wondered, go into the woods and just vanish, and the authorities just assume that they become lost, injured, or been victims of animal attacks with their bodies never recovered? Please God, don't let that happen to me, he thought, as he drew closer and closer to his truck. 75 yards became 50, and 50 became 30, and 30 became 10. Like a miracle, he was back and opening his door. Throwing his rifle inside, he pulled himself up to the cab and started the engine and hit the gas. But the truck went nowhere. He had parked in a large mud puddle, and now the tires simply spun, slinging mud 30 feet behind him. Oh no. Not now, he thought. I can't be stuck. Not now. Allowing himself a moment to think, Jacob remembered this truck as a four-wheeled drive. There's no way he can be stuck. Reaching down, he locked his truck into four-wheel drive and was prepared to punch the gas and leave this nightmare behind. Unfortunately for Jacob, some nightmares aren't so easily left behind, as there is nothing worse than a nightmare you can't wake up from, and Jacob was about to learn that the hard way. Hearing something to his right, he instinctively turned and immediately wished he did not. It took him maybe half a second to turn his head, but he would have given anything in the world to have that half second back, because it was the last moment that his world would ever seem normal again. In that split second, his world changed. It was no longer a place where the world was light and safe, where he was just a husband and a father and a guy that liked to hunt and watch football on weekends. That reality had evaporated away like early morning fog, and all that was left was a world where monsters existed and things really went bump in the night. And now an ambassador from that nightmare realm was standing just outside his passenger door, a visible reminder that his world had been turned upside down. Jacob screamed as he stared transfixed on this escapee from a horror movie. In his most terrifying, fevered dream, he couldn't have imagined such a thing could exist. It was hideously ugly, standing 8 feet tall with a thick, muscular body. It looked very apish in appearance, but then again it didn't. There was something about that face that was just wrong, almost like an obscene amalgamation of a man and animal that had gone horribly awry. It was the most terrifying thing he'd ever seen. It was completely covered in thick, shaggy black hair that was matted in areas with God only knows what. And it walked on 2 legs, not 4 like you'd expect from some kind of animal. What was this thing that had shattered his perception of reality? Was it a demon? A werewolf? It can't be, he thought. Those things don't exist. Maybe it was some kind of reject from the island of Dr. Moreau. Whatever it was staring at him, and it did not look happy. The menacing juggernaut threw its enormous head back and let out a blood-curdling scream that resonated throughout the surrounding area and seemed to vibrate him to his very core. Shocked back into action, Jacob threw his truck into gear and took off as though he were being chased by the very hounds of hell. Jacob, mind racing, wondered what he was going to do. How will I ever feel safe on this farm again, he thought. Are my wife and children in danger? Where did this thing come from, and will anyone believe me? The whirlwind of thoughts that swelled through Jacob's mind came to immediate stop as he slammed on his brakes and nearly slid off the road. In a state of disbelief, Jacob sat staring at the large hackberry tree that laid across the dirt road and blocked his path, preventing him from reaching the blacktop and guaranteed safety. How is this even possible, he thought. I just came down this road not even 30 minutes ago, and this path was clear. However this tree came across the road, it was painfully obvious to Jacob that he had to get that tree moved if he was going to make it home. Since he had neither a chain to pull the tree out of the road, nor did he have a saw with which he could cut up his unexpected barricade, he was left with few viable options, one of which was walking, which he discounted almost immediately. The most logical course of action he could come up with was to call for help. His best friend, Kenny Patterson, owned the farm just over from his. If he were home, he could bring a saw and cut the tree up for him. Jacob, with his nerves still frazzled and frayed, reached into his glove box and pulled out his cell phone and clumsily dialed Kenny's number. The phone rang 6 times, and Jacob was about to give up when Kenny answered the phone and said, "Hey ugly, what do you want this early in the morning?" As quickly as he could, he related the recent events to Kenny and said, "Man, please hurry, I'm not kidding, there is something out here." Kenny, hearing the shakiness in his friend's voice, assured him that he would be there in a matter of minutes. Jacob thanked him and hung up the phone, and braced himself for what he was sure to be the longest few minutes of his life. Sitting motionless with bated breath there in the truck, every sound made his imagination run wild with fear and expectance. Even though little more than 3 minutes had passed since he had spoken to Kenny, it felt as if hours had passed. Each tick of the clock seemed like an eternity. Jacob frequently checked in all directions for any sign of that nightmarish monstrosity that had pursued him. In every shadow that the forest and this irritatingly cloudy day produced, he thought he saw the shape of the black beast that had followed him out of the woods, and he was afraid that he would lose his sanity long before Kenny arrived to clear the tree out of his pathway. After what seemed like a lifetime, Jacob heard the sound of Kenny's old truck sputtering up the road, and in just moments he was able to see the old red Chevrolet as it made its way closer to him. Jacob's spirits lifted when he saw his old friend, and a sense of relief washed over him as he realized that he was no longer alone. Stepping out of his truck, Jacob said, "Man, what took you so long? I asked you to hurry." Kenny, with an indignant look on his face, said, "What are you talking about? You only called me 11 minutes ago. I think I made pretty good time." Jacob could hardly believe that only 11 minutes had passed. It seemed so much longer. After apologizing to his friend and telling him exactly how happy he was to see him, both men walked over to the fallen tree and made a discovery that startled them both. The tree had not broken, it had not been cut, it had been pushed over and completely uprooted. All around the tree were large bipedal footprints that had a somewhat human appearance to them, but if they were human, the owner would require a size 28 shoe. Jacob and Kenny looked at each other, and then without a word went to work on the tree. Kenny took a chainsaw from the bed of his truck and began to cut up the fallen blockade. Meanwhile, Jacob pulled the logs and debris from the road. Mission accomplished. Kenny put away his saw, and he and Jacob were about to get in their vehicles and leave. But before either man had even opened their doors, an ear-splitting scream that would have filled a banshee with paralyzing fear erupted from the woods behind them. Wearily, Jacob walked over to Kenny and whispered, "That's what I was telling you about. I don't know what that thing is, man, but it looks like some kind of monster, and I think we need to get out of here, now." Kenny, who looked as though the blood had drained completely out of his face, became very pale as he said to Jacob, "Jacob, man, I've never mentioned this to him before now, but over the last few months, that thing has been killing off a few of my cows. Their throats are usually torn out and bodies mangled and broken. I didn't want anyone to accuse me of being crazy and making stuff up, so I never said anything about it. But that's the reason I rushed over when you called. I heard that sound a few times off in the distance at night, but never this close. So I think you're right, old buddy. It's time to go." Cautiously and with a sense of urgency, Jacob and Kenny climbed into their vehicles and expeditiously made their ways to the blacktop. Turning left, both vehicles began a 2.5-mile trek that led back to Jacob's house so they could decide what course of action should be taken. Jacob could feel the temperature drop as snow began to gently fall. He reached over and turned his wipers on as snow began to pelt the windshield harder. As he passed his neighbour, William Springer's farm, he noticed a herd of deer grazing the field that bordered his own property. Having put a bit of distance between himself and the nightmare he had just encountered, Jacob felt a renewed sense of security as his fatigued nerves began to calm. Not willing to let this opportunity pass him by, Jacob turned on his hazard lights and pulled to the shoulder of the road and signalled Kenny to do the same. Kenny instinctively knew what Jacob was thinking and pulled in behind him and turned his ignition off. Getting out of his truck, Kenny said, "What are you doing, man? We need to get out of here, now." Jacob said, I know. We will in just a minute, man. I can't turn this down, man. I have to take the shot. There's a 6-point buck standing there. It's not the trophy I wanted, but at least I won't go home empty-handed. And after the morning we've had, I think we deserve a little something good." "Alright, just take the shot so we can go. I still don't feel right about this," Kenny said. Steadying his rifle across the hood of his truck, Jacob zeroed in on the buck and prepared to fire. That's when he heard Kenny make a gasping noise and whisper, "Oh my god." "What is it, man? What's wrong with you?" "Raise your scope 3 inches, he said. Raising the scope, Jacob immediately saw what had been the cause of Kenny's alarm. Standing just outside of the tree line in the edge of the field was the creature they had left behind. Not even 5 minutes. Was this thing following them? Was it after the deer? What was it doing? Jacob watched the creature through his scope for a full 30 seconds before it even moved, and when it did, it ignored him and the deer and started to lope off towards William's barn that was about 500 yards from where the woodland demon had been standing. Jacob called out to Kenny and said, "Kenny, call William and tell him there's something trying to get in his barn. I know he has at least 2 mares with fowls in there. If that thing gets in, it'll kill them all." In an attempt to be rid of this monster, werewolf, Sasquatch, Wendigo, or whatever it was, Jacob fired a shot but missed. The creature turned in their direction and glared at them through red hate-filled eyes, and then began to run towards them at full steam. Kenny, who was still on the phone with William, screamed at Jacob to get in his truck and go. Jacob did as he was told, and Kenny followed suit. Starting their trucks, Jacob and Kenny both raced to Jacob's house as though they were driving NASCAR. Arriving at home, Jacob, gun in hand, ran inside to get a phone book so they could call the game warden and the police to get some kind of animal control out there. Jacob had just stepped out of his front porch when they heard gunfire coming from over at William's place. Dropping the phone book and running back inside, Jacob grabbed his 12-gauge pump shotgun and some shells and handed them to Kenny, who took a little time in loading it. Jacob and Kenny, now locked and loaded, walked together to Kenny's truck, preparing to mount up a rescue for their neighbour William. Simultaneously, both of them stopped in their tracks as an uneasy but familiar feeling crept over them, and Jacob's Rottweiler and 2 German Shepherds began to whimper and ran under the front porch to hide. Kenny, whose throat had suddenly gone dry as a bone, whispered to Jacob and said, "I have a really bad feeling about this." No sooner had the words escaped his lips, they heard a deafening scream erupted from the forest off to their right, as the creature exploded from the trees in front of them. Until now, neither man had been able to fully appreciate the colossal size and scope of the beast, but standing less than 30 feet away, they were almost overcome by the sheer magnitude of it. Jacob had seen it up close earlier from his truck while sitting down, and had guessed the height may be 8 feet, but now standing there looking up, he could tell that this fellow was 8.5 to 9 feet tall, and would tip the scale at 800 to 1,000 pounds. It had inhumanly long arms that bulged with thick, ropey muscle that were easily seen beneath its long, shaggy black hair, which covered it from head to toe. The chest was larger than a 55-gallon drum, and there was little doubt that it could have pulled the arms off an ape, and now it glared at them with malevolent intent. Jacob and Kenny both opened fire without hesitation. The creature screamed with rage as the bullets tore into its massive body, knocking it to the ground, but not killing or seriously injuring it. Jacob and Kenny watched speechless as it crawled into the tree line, struggled to its feet and limped away. Jacob ran back to the porch and grabbed the phone book and called the local game warden. Nearly 2 hours later, Gene Trauber, the local warden, showed up to take their statements and told them that he had been called to answer numerous such reports in the area, but wasn't sure what to make of all of these reports. "Guys," he said, "I don't know what to tell you. There's no animal in this area, or any area for that matter, that fits the description. I'm not saying I don't believe you. I just don't know what it is." Jacob, whose face was reddened with anger, said, "Come here. Here is the blood from where we shot it, and here are the footprints." A look of complete confusion washed over Gene's face, and he asked if they would care to go with him as they tried to track it. Jacob and Kenny agreed, but they said they weren't going without a gun. Gene stated that he'd planned to take his gun as well. All 3 men loaded their guns and set out following the deeply impressed tracks and droplets of blood that had fallen on the withered leaves. They followed the trail out for about a mile until arriving at a creek that was located deep in Jacob's woods, where the tracks that they were following were joined by others just like them. Some were smaller, but at least one set was larger. Deciding the safest course of action would be to return home, they all went back to Jacob's. None of them relished in the idea of staying out in the woods longer, since there was now apparently more than one creature. The cloudy, overcast day made the forest seem even darker than it would normally be at this time of day. Back at Jacob's, Gene informed them that there was nothing left that they could do apart from file it under an unknown animal sighting, which made both Kenny and Jacob anything but happy. Jacob and Kenny spent the next couple of days trying to warn their neighbours to use caution when they were out in the forest. Most of their friends just laughed at them and said they probably had seen a bear or something. No one believed them, except William, who had seen it himself the same day they had. He'd even taken a shot at it but missed. Jacob, William and Kenny know what they had seen, and they knew it was still out there, and they didn't care who believed them and who didn't. Over the next few weeks, more and more neighbours began to take the story a little more seriously as family pets began to disappear, and others were found brutally mangled. Other farms in the area began finding their cows and other livestock torn open with their throats ripped out. Just a week after the shooting the creature in his yard, Jacob's own Rottweiler was found dead with his throat torn out, hanging across a limb in a tree in his front yard. It almost seemed like a revenge killing. A few days later, one of William's new foals died in the same way. The foal's mother had to be put to sleep because she had gone into shock over whatever she had witnessed there in the barn when her foal was killed. Some people in the area still don't believe. They think the whole story was made up. But Jacob and Kenny know that there is still something out there in that forest. They still occasionally find tracks, or a slaughtered cow or a goat. They still hear the blood-curdling screams off in the woods at night. They know that there is still something out there, watching, waiting, biding its time. Something cold, cunning and cruel. Something not human, with a taste for blood and revenge. I'm a huge record fan. I don't buy CDs. I rarely download music digitally. Most of the time, I just go to the record shop to buy used records. I'm also a huge fan of electronic music. Ask me to name 20 Kraftwerk songs and I'd be able to. So I was surprised when I came across a tiny independent band called Electrostall. From what I've heard, the name is Russian for electric steel, and it's also the name of some Russian town or city, but I digress. They only released one album back in '74. It was entitled Record Grooves. I looked at the record online, on some crappy independent record company site. It was a 7-inch single, and for all you younger people out there, a 7-inch single has only one song on each side of the album. After looking at the information, I saw that the record was just one song, but split into two parts. The title of the song was Electric Chair, so I have no idea where they got the title Record Grooves from. I did a bit more research and I was shocked to find that this is actually an incredibly rare single. Only 25 copies were made. That was because of financial problems back in the 70s, they could only produce that many. At least that's what I was told on the website. This was one of those records I just had to get. I went to the record shop, which I mentioned earlier. It was a tiny corner shop with a red door and sign, but inside, it was every record collector's dream. There were records everywhere, some in fantastic condition. If there was one place that record would be, it would be in a shop like this, I thought. I went and talked to the record shop owner, Mark. He's a real record boffin. He would most likely know about the record too. I was wrong. He looked kind of puzzled when I asked him about it. He said he'd never heard of it. I was kind of disappointed, but I looked around anyways. After looking for a while, I found it. I couldn't believe it. Unsurprisingly, the sleeve was not in great condition. It had a thick layer of dust over it, and part of the card which the artwork was printed on was exposed. That's when I noticed something a little bit odd. The artwork was different. The artwork shown online was a black cover with lips in the middle, but instead of lips it was an eye which was wide open, and what appeared to be a tear dropping out of it. Though it didn't bother me too much, many artists have different artwork for their albums, but there were only 25 made. Could they have even had different editions? Another thing which was odd was that the record itself was in perfect condition. Not a single speck of dust or scratch on it. I placed the record back in the sleeve and rushed back to the counter. I placed it on the desk and Mark looked at me strangely. "Strange," he said. "I don't remember getting this record in here." "How much?" I asked politely, but with anticipation. "Tell you what, have it free. I don't see any price tag and I don't remember getting it, so it's yours," he replied, still keeping the puzzled look on his face. I was surprised, but kind of happy at the same time. I didn't have much money on me at the time, and I didn't want anyone else getting on this record. I thanked Mark and made my way back home quickly. I made it home. I ran up to my bedroom and pulled the record out of its sleeve. I placed it carefully onto the turntable, switched on the record player, placed the needle on the first groove, and the record began to play. The intro was great. It sounded a lot like a Kraftwerk song, but with slightly deeper synths. It was also very catchy and the vocals were incredible. That's when things got strange. His vocals became more and more electronic, to the point where you could barely understand a word he was saying. The music in the background went out of tune. It became almost unbearable to listen to. It was just strange electronic nursery rhymes with loud, undefinable music in the background. Finally, and this is when things got really strange, he asked a girl in the same room with him to sing. There was a pause. The music kept playing in the background for a minute, and then you could hear the microphone move. That was when I could hear a girl crying and sniffling. Once again, Junior yelled at the girl, "Sing, sing!" She would just keep crying, but each time Junior would yell at her, she would cry and yell louder. Then she screamed at the top of her lungs, "Someone help me, please!" The music kept playing in the background as Junior chuckled to himself. I was starting to get worried. It didn't sound like she was acting. She was genuinely screaming for help. I continued to listen nervously, while Junior chuckled with a disturbed joy. You could hear him pressing what at first I thought were keys and buttons on a synthesizer, but with one large click, there was suddenly a loud crackling and buzzing noise, and the girl began to scream louder and louder. Then I realized. I grabbed the sleeve from my desk, flipped it over and looked at the back. The title of the song was Electric Chair. I dropped the sleeve in panic, as I realized the buzzing sound was not a synthesizer at all. It was a literal electric chair. I grabbed the record from the turntable, placed it back in the sleeve, and put the sleeve in my money safe. I did not sleep well that night. What I heard on the record was too much. The brutal cries of the girl and the subtle laughter of Junior was haunting. As my eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness of the room, I stared at the safe. However, I couldn't stay awake much longer, and eventually I fell asleep. At about 4:30 in the morning, I was suddenly awoken. A loud, thick and electrifying sound filled the room. I jumped and looked directly towards where the source of the sound was coming from. It was coming from the record player. To my absolute shock, I saw the record. It was playing the B-side of the record. Once again I could hear electronic sounds buzzing, the laughter of Carl Jr. came out, and hypnotic electronic music playing loudly in the background. I jumped out of bed, ran towards the record, grabbed it and switched on the light. I was shocked to see markings on the record, which spelled out the words look, smell, and in small writing on the A side of the record, the word electrifying. It looked as if someone carved the letters into the record grooves with a burning hot nail. I couldn't take it any longer. I threw the record and the sleeve out the window, and the next day I went into my backyard and destroyed it. The old man living next door to our house came over that day, asking what all the noise was the previous night. I told him that I didn't know, and there was most likely nothing to worry about. I couldn't have possibly explained what really happened. I was extremely quiet that day. Whilst listening to some old blues records to try and calm me down, I would look out the window and see bits of broken vinyl scattered across the yard. I would try to ignore it, but I couldn't. I then ran downstairs, grabbed a shovel and went out back. I tried to grab the record, but it was incredibly hot. I had to get a towel to pick up all the pieces. I dug a small hole and threw bits of vinyl in the pit as well as the sleeve. I poured some old vodka over the album, took one last look at it and lit the bastard on fire. Once the flames were gone, later that evening, I filled the hole. All that was left was ash and melted plastic. I was glad to get that piece of shit out of my life. 7 years later. I could still remember the horrors of that record, but I was not so bothered because nothing happened after I destroyed it. But then I noticed something strange. Something I hadn't noticed before. A smell. A thick and strong one. Almost like the smell of burning chars or overcooked meat. That's when I remembered, and that's when I began to panic. The record had look, smell engraved onto the grooves, but I had my doubts to whether this had anything to do with the smell. I began to follow the scent. It was coming from my basement. I then tracked the smell to a large crack on the basement wall. Strangely, this was the only crack on the wall, and I had not previously noticed it. I nervously approached it. Whatever that smell was, it came from behind the wall. I reached out my hand cautiously and touched the wall. It was incredibly warm, whereas the rest of the wall was freezing, considering it was the middle of winter. Suddenly, a part of the wall collapsed, and dirt and bits of rock rushed in onto the floor of my basement. I ran back so that I didn't get crushed by the debris of the wall. I was shocked, but also infuriated that my wall just collapsed. I grabbed a shovel and started shoving dirt into a large bucket. My heart stopped and I could feel my stomach churning. I saw a seemingly electrocuted body of a girl. Her face was black with burn marks, with smoke coming off her hair, and her teeth were cracked in dark brown colour. Her skin was a crispy texture, and bits of her dead and burnt skin were laid across the floor of my basement in the dirt. I saw that blood was dripping from her eyes, and the thick smell of burnt flesh filled the entire room, to the point where I almost vomited. I collapsed onto the floor and crawled away in panic, silent but terrified. I wanted to let out a yell or a cry, but I was petrified. I sat for almost 30 minutes in silence. I was breathing heavily, I wasn't blinking, and I was shaking. I was looking at the body for 20 minutes, but I finally built up the courage to look at the burnt corpse. I turned, and in her hand was a copy of Electroskull's record grooves. No one should experience what I had. It was very cold last February. Absurdly cold. I was a paper delivery boy in Ohio, doing some part-time work to pay my house rent as a college student. Last February, a storm dumped 5 inches of snow over the town. Everything in sight was white and frosty. On my way to the post office, I saw a small black and white cat tied to a lamppost with an elongated choker. Its large eyes darted around frantically like it was waiting to be rescued by its owner. I cycled away, minding my own business. Surely its owner would have been in the newsagent shop nearby, stopping for a can of beer or something. They should come back for the cat soon, I thought. Anyway, who the hell even walked their cat? It must have been a kid. After doing my paper round, it was time for college. It had been 3 hours since I'd started the round for that day. Thus, I expected the cat I saw in the morning to be gone by then. However, as I approached the lamppost, I could see from a distance that it was still there. I couldn't help but feel worried about the situation. It was bitterly cold, and the temperature was dipping into the negatives. The cat was pacing around the lamppost hurriedly, almost desperately. 2 days later, it was still there. Nobody had come back for it. Perhaps it had been abandoned. Concerned about its welfare, I decided to take it to my house and rehome it comfortably. It wasn't ideal, as I had never had any sort of experience with pets before, but at least it would have stopped suffering unnecessarily in the cold. It would be provided with food and a place to sleep. I cut the string that tied it, then took it in, and pasted posters on lampposts and fences around town reading, "Lost cat found," with additional contact details. The cat didn't like to eat very much. It had a huge, painful looking scar on its belly where the skin had been sewn together, perhaps from an operation. When it did eat, however, it swallowed its food whole in large chunks. This prompted me to cut the food up in smaller bits to prevent it from choking. During the day, it would pace around my house and jump on the furniture, meowing and purring. But during the night, it would always come into my room and sit at the front of my bed. It seemed to be a well-learned habit. If I didn't let it into the bedroom, it would continually scratch on the door until I gave in and opened it. On the first night, it stayed in my room. I was woken up by the sound of light clicking. I wasn't sure whether it was actually clicking, tapping, or ticking, but it sounded like something mechanical. I figured the source of the noise was probably my keys hanging from my trouser pocket, tapping the edge of the bed. I sat up a little, and the noise stopped. I nearly had a heart attack when I saw 2 green shining eyes staring right at me in the darkness. They were wide open and glowed like phosphorus. A heartbeat later, I calmed down a little after I realised it was just the cat. But it still felt extremely uncomfortable, being pinned down by those eyes in the dead of night. I laid down and tried my best to dismiss it, constantly eyeing the silhouette perching at the foot of my bed. Even though I felt like a cowardly 5-year-old, I didn't want to close my eyes, knowing that another pair of eyes was watching me as I slept. Half a minute later, the eyes relaxed a little. I saw the cat blink and move. It started to stroll naturally around the room again. So, I brushed it off and went back to sleep. But every night or so after that, I would wake up and that same fading clicking noise. Every time I woke up, I would find the cat staring straight at me, but then it would break eye contact and walk away once it realised I was conscious. I found the behaviour slightly strange, but I reckoned it was just shy, and it wanted to observe some human behaviour rather than falling snow for a change. Besides, cats are nocturnal animals, right? Excusing the dodgy eating habits and midnight staring, which were only minor concerns, my new friend caused me no other trouble. My house came with a cat flap in the front door. The landlord had a cat. I could let this cat in and out of the house freely. It didn't attack the neighbourhood pets or vandalise property. It didn't bite people or bring me dead birds and rats. It didn't even leave piss or shit around the house. My cat was a good cat. It had been a month, but nobody had called to claim the cat. I decided to legitimately make it mine and gave it a new name, Scotty. I wasn't sure whether Scotty was male or female, but it didn't matter much to me. The act of naming him or her itself counted as a bonding ritual, a gateway to a beautiful friendship between two different species forged by mutual care. From then on, Scotty was my source of comfort. When my exams weren't going well, when I was having a bad day, or when I'd had an argument, I would always tell Scotty. Even though he was just a cat and probably didn't understand the bullshit I was going through, or even my language as a matter of fact, I could always count on him to cheer me up. Things were getting weird around the time Scotty had been taken in. I kept questioning everything I did because at first, I reckoned the strange occurrences were due to my own carelessness. Some days when I arrived at home, the door would be unlocked. It seemed odd because I always locked the door when I went out. I rarely forget to do so. I suspected a burglary, but second-guessed myself often. Perhaps the burglar had gotten hold of my spare keys. I checked in the garage, but they were still where I put them. Furthermore, nothing had been stolen. Once, I left two $50 notes blatantly visible on my desk, but they hadn't been taken. That's why I was hesitant to call the police. The scariest fucking thing greeted me when I got up in the morning one day. A note was left beside my pillow, written in messy, screwy handwriting I didn't recognize. It read, "Did you sleep well, Brian? I was watching you." I suddenly panicked and wondered who it was. How did they know my name? All the windows had been locked tightly before I'd gone to sleep, and I'd locked the doors too. I checked everything twice. There couldn't have been an intruder. Then I remembered there was only one other living thing in the house beside me, but surely Scotty couldn't have written it. It must have been my crazy imagination. Obviously, I knew cats didn't know English, and couldn't write. Was I dreaming? Was I going insane? Shit, you must be joking, I murmured to myself. But if it wasn't Scotty, then who was it? Was I hallucinating? There was no evidence of a break-in. If I showed the police, they'd just think I was an attention-seeking note forger who had nothing better to do than prank them. But I was sure I had not written that note. There was no way out of this. Hours of sweat-dripping fear later, and after checking all the windows and doors had been locked multiple times, I told myself I would play along with it, to give myself some comfort at least. If it was a dream, I would wake up and curse myself for being so stupid and gullible. But for now, I would believe it, because it was the only explanation. I spoke to Scotty in English, feeling stupid. "Don't scare me like that, Scotty, okay? You know I'm faint of heart." He meowed back. He wasn't going to communicate with me verbally. Well, he's a cat after all. So I figured it would be easier if I wrote a message back on the paper. It would allow for some distance. "Who are you? How do you know me?" I wrote. I left it beside my bed. The next day, my note was replaced with another phantom message. "My name is Scotty. Of course I know you. I watch you all day and night." I shook my head and opened my mouth in disbelief as I finished reading the note. Then I patted myself on the back for outsmarting natural human narrow-mindedness. The supernatural was real. Of course, as you can imagine, I was terrified for a few moments. I wondered if I'd ever come to terms with the fact that my cat was sending me messages written on pieces of paper in English. Then I wondered if it was such a bad thing after all. Perhaps I could use this to my advantage, and talk to the entire animal kingdom or discover some crucial biological breakthrough. Could all animals understand human language like Scotty? If they could, then no. I was thinking too far ahead. Right now, all I needed to know was that everything I had ever told Scotty, all my hopes, fears and desires, they had been understood and taken into account. Another being had shared my pain. Scotty understood me. Suddenly, I no longer felt so isolated. Maybe people would think I was crazy, writing messages to my cat, but as long as I knew it was real, there was nothing to worry about. There was a being in this world I could talk to. I tapped my assignment into my computer as I waited for Scotty to come down from my room, thinking about this prospect. I drank my Coke and spun around in my wheelie chair, simultaneously pushing the table. I really did have a friend after all. I thought, smiling to myself. Suddenly, I heard a cracking sound, followed by a loud clank and the sound of something popping. Some hard object obstructed the back of my wheelie chair. I felt it bulging beneath me. Immediately looking down to see what the obstruction was, I cried out in devastation and horror. It was Scotty. The wheel of my chair had rolled onto his neck and severed his head. It lay detached from his body on the floor. His arms twitched and body convulsed. My instant reaction was fear and guilt. He had been so silent, but despite that, how on earth did I not see him there? I thought he was still up in my room. Then Scotty twitched for the final time and laid still as a rock. Then it dawned upon me. I had just killed my best friend with one careless backward roll. It was all my fault. I began to cry and call out his name, the shame overwhelming me. But about 10 seconds later, I stopped in confusion. There was no blood. I bent down to observe the body. My eyebrows curved as I saw something black and silver inside his body. Something that definitely should not have been inside a cat's body. The silver things rotated and seemed to have teeth. Were they gears? No way! What the hell were mechanical gears doing inside a cat? I picked up the body gingerly, and suddenly I saw a network of metal inside his body. I looked down his neck, and his neck bone was a single metal screw-like rod. His ribs were metal. He seemed to have no internal organs, but there was a pinkish, fleshy tint surrounding the metal. I shuddered, and then similarly picked up his head. There were twisting red and yellow spirally things coming out from the bottom of his head. Wires? Jesus Christ. I couldn't see his brain, but I could see the inside of his skull, which was made of metal. I could also see in between the metal, and I saw real, pinkish flesh. I must have been drugged. What the hell was going on? Then I tried something absurd. I placed his head on top of the metal screw protruding from the stump that used to be his neck. To my horror, I felt something lock into place. I twisted his head, and it gradually lowered as if it was tightening a screw. Soon, Scotty looked as if he hadn't just been killed. One of his eyes rotated to look at me. I shrieked in shock and dropped him. I didn't care if it was real or not, a hallucination or nightmare. Perhaps the whole thing was just one big delusional dream, and in real life I was actually some insane crack addict. I remember that day. I honestly wished that I was. I just wanted to get away from the monstrosity that I'd seen and bolted outside, locking the door. I called the emergency services, just managing to wheeze out a few words as my heart raced like I was dying from a heart attack. Hello? Yes, I think my cat's an android. To my irritation, they sent an ambulance. It was a blatant slap in the face saying, "There's something wrong with this guy." To be completely honest, I shouldn't have been as shocked or offended as I was then. My claim didn't seem very valid, now that I think about it. But I really did hope that I was just being a crazy bastard. Scotty looked and felt so real. He did everything a normal cat would do. How on earth could this happen? Okay, he might have had some behavioural problems, but... I begged them to go inside the house and see for themselves. I pointed at Scotty, standing beside the wheelie chair. One of the guys picked up Scotty. Scotty didn't move, and I could tell suspicions were growing. Unable to stand it any longer, I grabbed the cat's body and unscrewed its head. The paramedics turned white. When they eventually discovered that I was telling the truth, the police were rightfully called to my place. I told them everything, about how I'd taken Scotty in, about the notes beside my pillow. They exchanged shifty glances amongst one another. Finally, they insisted that I'd create this monstrosity to waste their time and arrested me. Well, what did I expect? Sane humans to believe me? Because the cat seemed oddly realistic, they carried out an investigation for the sake of animal rights, searching my house and rummaging through my stuff. I doubt they expected to find anything. I slept in the police station for 3 days. I talked to some of the officers and the other people walking around the place. Most offenders had been arrested on charges of drug abuse or drink driving when they asked me what I had been detained for. I always replied, long story. Even in the company of busy holidaymakers and staff, I still felt like I was being watched. I would often wake up several times in the night in a cold sweat, expecting to see those two green eyes again. Yesterday, I was escorted to my property again, as the officers in charge of my case wanted to speak to me. They had called my landlord to the scene too. We asked them what they found. They told us that the house had been broken into. In the middle of a full-scale search of the house, they'd heard something smashing in the garage. Someone had escaped out the garage window when they smelt the police presence. The perpetrator left a bloody knife behind, perhaps a murder weapon and something else. One of the officers showed it to us. It was like a little Apple tablet. It had two small rods of antennae. It was stored in one of those transparent crime scene evidence packets, but it had a touchscreen which could still be used through the material. There were buttons on the screen. The cop pointed at another packet bit of evidence. Scotty. He was as stiff as a doornail and did not move inside the packet. The cop pressed a green button and to my surprise, Scotty meowed. Pressed another button and Scotty lifted his leg. But most disturbing of all was the screen display between the buttons. The cop went over and lifted Scotty's bodies up so his eyes were looking directly at me through the layer of plastic. My face and everything behind me appeared on the screen on the tablet. There were many files saved on the menu of the tablet. All were named Sleeping 1 or Sleeping 2 or Sleeping some other number. They all contained stored night vision footage of me sleeping. The incision in Scotty's belly had been made to insert a complicated system of robotic mechanical features into the body of an already dead cat, which could be controlled by using the device. The new robot cat was made as realistic as possible, and could move with the fluidity and agility of a living cat if the user was skilled. The eyes acted as windows for the cat and the user. Each button was a control command. There was also more complex code inside each command which the user could edit accordingly. I started to sweat. I realized that someone or something had understood my ranting, had understood my fears, hopes and dreams, but it wasn't Scotty. And that someone or something, hiding in my garage, had been watching me sleep. Again, it wasn't Scotty. Waves of dread came upon me. The cop handed me one final specimen in a plastic bag. It was a note, in that same messy handwriting I assumed was Scotty's, left beside my pillow. It was found after the police took Scotty away. Haha, joke's on you. Scotty hadn't written that. 1 week ago, a group of young middle school children, a mixture of boys and girls, all friends, went on a camping trip into the nearby woods. The only reason I know this is because I have a brother who went on this trip. Our parents told him to be careful and not to climb tall trees. He said okay and left. I watched from my bedroom as he walked off and disappeared into the mid-afternoon sun. None of them have come back since they were supposed to. The police were contacted. A search party with only under a fourth of the townsfolk was launched. I was among this party. At first, everything seemed just creepy. The woods is always dark, and there's a rumour that a mental institute inmate had escaped into the woods. Except, it was only a rumour, and there were no mental institutes near our town. So we followed the path they had all supposedly taken, and eventually, we found their camp. The camp was perfectly normal. Everything was in perfect condition, and the fire pit still had some glowing embers. We all sighed in relief. But then I felt strange and started looking around. I don't know what had alerted me, but I knew something was wrong. After 3 minutes of looking, somebody screamed. We all rushed over and looked to see what had happened or what they'd found. Several people puked. Some of the women started crying. Everyone looked away. Everyone but me. An intangible mess of body lay before me, burned beyond recognition. It wasn't black like in the movies. It was a mixture of coal black and gooey looking bright red. I looked around and studied the scenario, then saw something that made tears fall down my cheeks. my brother's favourite yo-yo. I'd fallen to my knees and started sobbing. I couldn't, and I still can't believe my brother is gone. As I stared at his carcass, I knew one thing. Whoever and whatever did this was a monster. After a few days, I packed up a few supplies, including my father's .22 pistol, and went on a search into the woods. I was going to find whatever had killed my brother, and I was going to kill it. I told my parents I was heading off to a friend's house for a couple of days, so I was covered. I spent the first hour of my search looking around the area of the camp. Nothing. And I knew I wouldn't find anything, because I had no clue what I was doing. But then I found something different. A cardboard sign saying "this way." Like an idiot, I followed the sign's instructions. After a few hours or so, I came across a small creek with large rocks on both sides. I stared in shock and disgust at the dark, crusty red stains on them. Blood. I looked at it and eventually figured out which direction it had been going. I followed it best as I could, but eventually I lost it. Then I realized I myself was lost. I frantically looked around for anything familiar, and then noticed something odd. I had come across an old abandoned cabin site, most likely for summer getaways. I slowly moved forward, checking inside all the cabins and finding nothing. Then I came across one that towered over the rest, a 3-story one. I opened the door, feeling my heart attempting to rip itself out my chest. I took 3 deep breaths and shut my eyes, trying to calm myself down. After seeing that I had failed, I opened my eyes and reached my left foot forward, hoping that the floorboard didn't break. It didn't. I quietly closed the door behind me and checked my surroundings. The room I was currently in had rotted floorboards, peeling paint chips and cobwebs. I then noticed something out of place. Fresh blood. My heart once again jumped into my throat and my eyes began to burn, but I continued on. As I entered the next room, I noticed several doors leading off to various places. I opened one to hear a loud, creaking noise coming from upstairs, and I felt something warm and wet running down my pants. I entered the door and found that I could not see anything. I closed the door behind me and started bumping around for somewhere I could hide. I found a table and I quickly slipped underneath it, trying to slow my breathing. Thump, thump, thump. Hearing the footsteps, I stopped trying to breathe at all, thinking that by this point any sound I made would be heard. Slowly, almost excruciatingly, the door that I'd come in from had opened, and a pair of black-clad feet started walking around the room, dragging something behind it. A black bag. I noticed a hand hanging out. I covered my mouth to keep from puking and continued to watch, my vision growing blurry from the tears running down my face. Eventually, the bag was placed in a corner with some other random items and the feet left. I didn't want to see what was in the corner, or what was above those feet. I laid there for at least a minute, or 50. There seemed to be no difference now, before I finally stood up. I looked ever so carefully at the corner, seeing completely fresh blood dripping down from the bag. I got the door open carefully and stepped through into the room I'd been in before. I slowly started pulling my gun out, and something jumped at me. It was too fast for me to see what it was, or it was the fact that it knocked me to the ground, but I closed my eyes and tried to push it off. I felt a wet sensation trickling down my arm, and I screamed in pain and terror as I finally managed to push the thing away from me. I opened my eyes and reached for my gun, but it was just out of reach. I looked up at the thing that had attacked me, and saw the most horrifying sight I'd ever seen. Its face hung loosely, the flesh almost leathery and burned, and I could clearly see patches of skull. Its eyes were pure white, it had no mouth, and then I noticed its hand. The right hand of the creature was mutilated beyond human. It had sharp blades stitched everywhere into it, and the fingers were cut off and replaced with what looked like animal claws, sharpened to the point that the tip was almost invisible. Yet I had felt those breach my skin. But the creature's virile body was the most horrible. It had gashes and blades stitched everywhere, and I think I'd seen a head inside of its torso. I watched as it slowly started towards me, twitching its hands ever so violently, and its head twisting and turning to odd angles, almost like an owl's. As a last hope, I leaped towards my gun and grabbed it, training the sights upon the creature and firing the entire magazine into its chest. A horrible gurgling screaming sound erupted from it, and the region of its face where the mouth should have been ripped open as a black ichor flowed forth freely. I got up and ran. I ran for hours until I reached the town, never looking back, hoping that it wouldn't follow me. I can still hear the screams to this day. I had gone to my friend's house, bloody, wounded and crying, and I stared at the horror upon his face. He and his family called 911. Evening had fallen, and I thought I'd heard the creature outside again and began screaming incoherently. It had only been a raccoon. The police and an ambulance showed up, and while I was whisked away to the hospital, the police asked me what happened. I told them that I'd seen a creature off in the woods in an old abandoned cabin that had attacked me and tried to kill me. They didn't seem to understand me, so I told them again, and I saw looks of disbelief and judgment on their faces. 3 days later, I was released from the hospital. I had told the police everything I could, and my parents were angry with me, yet they seemed glad that I was okay, and told me that they had a surprise at home. When we got home, I was barely moving, looking in every shadow expecting something to jump out and attack me. We got inside quickly, and was greeted with a sad yet happy look upon my brother's face. My dead brother. After that day, I've heard the creature come to my window at night, asking me to come outside, and how alone the creature is. I'll never forget that scream. My brother can't recall what happened to him or his friends. All he knows is that for some reason he had woken up outside the house, all memory of the camping trip gone. I am completely certain he is not my brother. I believe everyone from that trip is still, and always will be, missing. And so will I. In any city in any country, go to any elementary school you can get yourself into and be sure to wear sturdy, comfortable gloves. Confidently enter the school and seek out a classroom with the youngest children inside. Ignore any who question you or attempt to impede you in any way. They seek only to delay you. Let no one and nothing stand in your way. Once in the classroom, approach the instructor, stand face to face and demand to see the holder of the game. If the instructor says or does anything, flee, for your freedom is now at stake. Keep running until your body drops and you sleep where you fall. You'll know in the morning if you've managed to ascertain your freedom. If, however, the instructor stops abruptly and stares silently over your right shoulder, you're in the right place. Do not turn around. Instead, announce with as much confidence as you can muster, "It is time for the game." Behind you, you will hear many skittering noises, interrupted by the occasional thud of a stone hitting sand. Resist any temptation to turn and look. It will only serve to unnerve you, because you'll need your full wits about you soon enough. Instead, wait until the sounds have ceased. Wait patiently. It can take minutes, even hours. When the sounds passed, remain motionless. The instructor will announce, "It is waiting its amusement." Then, and only then, slowly turn around. The scene before you will, quite to your surprise, be the same one when you enter the room. The only change will be that the desks have moved up against the walls. The children will have formed a circle and will be sitting facing the centre, in absolute silence, eyes tight shut. The effect you'll feel may be unnerving, but do not show it or let it deter you. You must quickly enter the circle. Be assured this is not the same room that you entered earlier. It is no longer safe. The inside of the circle, on the other hand, is safe, so feel free to take a moment once you're in the circle to gather yourself, regain your equilibrium, and perhaps even stretch in preparation to run. You will have to soon enough. When you are prepared as you are able, approach any child and stare at their eyes, shut as they are. You must ask, how does it entertain? Stare intently into the child's closed eyes, waiting for their response. If there's no response, move quickly to the next child on either side and repeat the question. Depending on the person you are, it can take as many as 8 trips around the entire circle, or as little as only as a few children. There's no rush here. When eventually a child opens its eyes, if you find yourself staring into empty black sockets, then you must prepare for the game. After a pause, the child's face will contort into the look of rapt excitement. The holder is coming. Before you will again hear the sound of skittering and stone hitting sand. This time, however, you will hear the sound of running feet. Resist the urge to turn and look at what is rushing so eagerly towards you. It will not take long to arrive and join the game, eager to play. Its arrival will be announced by high shrieking laughter, and it will persist until you turn. When you do, you'll find yourself face to face with the holder of the game. The holder of the game can appear as anyone who was ever a child. Do not be fooled. This does not mean it is one itself. It will be dressed conservatively in whatever clothes are appropriate for its guise. The only distinguishing mark will be the mild look in its eyes, the look of complete, utter exuberance. Do not meet its eyes. You will only be distracted then, and you really can't afford that. The holder will extend its right hand, keeping its left tucked behind its back. It will ask, "Shall we play?" Ignore its words and its offer of greeting. Instead, concern yourself with its left hand. Those gloves are necessary, for if any part of the holder's hand should touch any part of your flesh, you will be doomed to the circle for eternity. Thus is the nature of the game. Carefully remove the object from the holder's left hand. The holder will make a great show of resistance, but you'll find it surprisingly easy to retrieve the object. A simple rubber ball. Once you're holding the ball, the holder will stop and begin staring at it with rapt attention. When you feel you are ready, remove either glove and hold the ball in your bare hand. Bounce it once on the floor and catch it. You'll feel great joy as if all your cares and worries have been lifted. Do not allow yourself to stop enjoying this feeling. Turn and run for the door. From behind you, hopefully, you'll hear sounds again. The secret approaches will echo in your ears. The halls will reverberate with the sound of every child in the world counting 1, 2, 3. Do not concern yourself with the counting, or anything at all. Merely clutch your prize and run, using whatever means you possess to travel as far away from the school as possible. You will know if you make it in the end. The rubber ball is object 185 of 538. When the counting stops, the holder shall become the seeker, and then the game will truly begin. Tonight is the night after Halloween. I write this now so that I'll have a while before he rises again. Why, you may ask? Do I write on the internet of all places the key to my enemy's prison? It is to keep him locked away. I am bound by certain rules, and I must obey them, even unconsciously. It must be possible for him to escape. I cannot, however much I want to, make escape beyond his means. So, I am creating my own loophole, so that I will at least know how he escapes. There are a few things you'll need. A mirror, full length if possible, something made of silver, something broken unnaturally, wood split against the grain, a mineral broken along the cleavage planes, a prime number of candles, 7 is ideal, and a blue rose. Usually a deal breaker, but luckily for you it's only symbolic, so you can dye a white rose. Yes, I did go out on my way to make sure the timing of the ritual was difficult. It must be started at exactly midnight on the day before Halloween, and the moon must be new. Set up the mirror and make sure the surface is perfectly flawless. No cracks, no smudges. I suggest you Windex it. Place the blue rose and the broken object on the ground about a foot in front of the mirror, and light your candles in a row at the base of the mirror. These will serve as a barrier, so if you wish you can simply speak to him and send him away. If at any time you wish to do this, tell him I never break a promise. These are the last words I said to him, and they now bind him. Stand behind the blue rose and kneel before the mirror. Call his name loudly. He is vain and will most likely respond faster if you call him Lord, or even better, King. No, I will not write his name. I will only tell you he shares a name with the mother of the god of wine. Easy hint, especially with the power of Google, I know. But names are powerful. Even for me to type it. No, I won't even think of it. Another thing, do not bring up his feminine name. Though he cannot physically harm you, he has methods, even when imprisoned. He will appear. It is of little matter where you are or who you are. He will not pass up any chance to escape. If you wish not to talk to him but to free him, stay kneeling and say, I will be your servant, master, if you will have me. Above all, do not look up, even as he speaks. He will ask you what you expect in return. Money? There'll be no need for it. Power? You will answer only to him. Men? Women? By the thousands. Just one? Your lifelong crush. All yours, just tell him, and he'll tell you what he wants from you. That is your last chance to back out. To say no, to send him away and pretend it all never happened. But if you are determined, you may now look at him and tell him, as you desire, master. His appearance fluctuates, but out of vanity, he will always be attractive and most likely blonde. All the times I saw and fought him, he also had a large, pointed, elvish ears. It's too late to back out if you've already reached this point. Whatever you have made of silver, use it now to break the mirror and blow out the candles, and he will be free. Please, if you are human, if you have any hint of heart or soul, do not do this. He will kill everyone you love, everyone you know, and everyone in your world. And it won't just be him. He will expect you to kill as well. He will force you to remove their souls from their bodies so he can put something else in. Everyone will be replaced by creatures of evil and decay. And when your Earth is conquered, it still won't be the end. There are greater worlds beyond yours, which he will set his sights on. I don't mean to sound self-centered, but I will suffer most of all. See, everyone will just die. They may be tortured first, but death is still the end result for them. But he has something special for me. You and I, we will be forced to see him destroy everything we hold dear. But you'll be the second most powerful creature in the universe. Tell me, is it worth it? I do not believe that this is how it will end. I hope we will be able to imprison him again, and you with him. But if you do this and you succeed and he wins, I swear by God, creation, and all the guardians that you and I will die together while I am killing him, whether you are aiding me or trying to stop me, and then we'll all face judgment. It all happened the night of my bachelor party. I was out with my two best friends, Todd and Neil. We started the night out at my favourite steakhouse in the city, Jose's Prime. Neil, being a larger man than Todd and I combined, put away two 30-ounce steaks in the time that would surprise any bulk eater. I had managed to finish a single 32, even while my appetite had taken quite a blow at the sight of Neil eating a whole animal-sized portion of food. Todd, my best man, had a 16-ounce porterhouse that he had barely finished. He was a tall, lanky sort of guy, kind of the physical opposite of Neil. He and Neil often joked that between the two of them, they could make two regularly sized people. We finished up at the steakhouse and headed over to Kolya, a high-end cigar bar on the other side of town. There we sat and smoked as we watched the last half of the Eagles-Jets game. I had no previous knowledge of Todd's itinerary for the evening. He and Neil planned it out for months in advance, and went to great measures to assure that I would know nothing of what they had in mind. Up until that point, the night was going great. I'd never been one who needed extravagance in his agenda to have a good time. I had always preferred to keep things simple and with a few good friends. Up until then, the night had been just that. I did my best to allow my friend the element of surprise, but it did bother me when I asked Todd where we'd be going after the cigar bar, and he and Neil remained silent. Granting my friend the surprise effect was more of a gift to him than it was for my own benefit, for I had always grown especially anxious of the awareness of impending surprises. However, I gritted my teeth and remained off topic. I started out on the passenger side window trying to guess where we might have been heading, but to my friend's credit, I had no idea where the night would be heading. This was only made completely evident when we finally pulled into the parking lot of what appeared to be a strip club called Red Fantasy. I thought it was a prank at first and laughed it off. The laughing stopped, however, when I noticed that Todd was pulling into a parking spot. Never having been to a strip club before, nor ever showing any interest in going to one at all, I interjected. Todd and Neil, though, were set on taking me in with promise that it won't be that bad and we don't have to stay long. Eventually, I gave in. The building was a relatively small one. It was dark, as if it had been painted black on the outside. There were no windows and only a single glass door that was too foggy to see anything through. I would not have even known what the club was called were it not for the small pink neon sign that hung above the door. I would have liked to think that if my friends were going to take me to one of these places, they would have picked a nice one to go to. Instead, we had found ourselves at one of the seediest little knocks that I had ever seen of any kind of establishment. Walking into the club, my friends and I were hit with a strong wind of smelling of sweat and dime store perfume. My friends paid my $20 cover charge to a scantily clad woman behind a small booth at the front before taking me into action. I had only a brief window of time to formulate an expectation based on what I had seen in the movies and television shows. But what I saw was much different than anything I could have imagined. Beautiful women, easily 20 or 30 of them, all strutting around with little or no clothes on. There did not seem to be any other male patrons, or even men working at the club. But this was not nearly as surprising as the obvious. All of the women working that evening were some of the most gorgeous women I'd ever seen. Some of them were relaxing and talking among themselves in the house seats, while others were completely naked and casually dancing on the stage. The song playing was a catchy melodic number that I failed to recognise. As I came round on the idea of enjoying my time at the club, I remember turning to Neil on my left and telling them that my fiancée was never to find out about this part of the night. After we walked in, it seemed that all of the women turned their attention to us, what with not having any other customers to attend to. My friends and I became the centre of attention, though the music was too loud to hear what he was saying. I witnessed Todd pull a waitress aside, talk into her ear, hold up 3 fingers, pointed at me, and handed the girl some cash. The waitress looked over at me and smiled before walking away. Todd came up to me and told me that he had ordered us all drinks. I was still on edge from being well beyond my comfort zone, but as I sat back in my chair and watched the girls up on stage dance to the rhythm of the music, I found myself becoming more and more relaxed. Within seconds after our beers had reached us, 2 dancers came over to me dressed in minimal amounts of clothing. Todd had evidently paid for my lap dance. When the girls began dancing around me, I felt my face glow bright red. I didn't know whether to laugh, leave, or give my best man a good throat punch for subjecting me to all that. I noticed that my anxiety had begun to rise once more, of which I tried to quell with my drink. The beer helped ease my general discomfort, but only to a point where I could bear the show. After the dance, I told my friends that I wanted to leave. They groaned, actually managing to enjoy themselves, but obliged my request. As we got up to leave, several of the girls came over and objected. They told us that we had been their only customers all night, leading me to believe that the place must have just opened, for these women were far too attractive not to warrant plenty of traffic. They told us that if we stayed, they would give us all complimentary private shows. Todd and Neil looked over to me like children pleading with their parents to buy them a new toy. I sighed and agreed, both for their sake and for my own damning curiosity. A girl, a redhead in her early 20s who called herself Lilith, led me to a room to the side of the main theatre. As she showed me in, I saw that other dancers were escorting Todd and Neil to their own private rooms. The woman closed the door behind me. The room was small. The walls were padded in bright red. A single light hung above a black lounge chair in the center of the room. Lilith instructed me to lay on the chair and relax. Only one of those commands I was actually able to follow through on. As I sat back in the chair and tried to force comfort into myself, for I knew this opportunity may never come again, I watched as a girl danced around me. She wore a tight black top and matching short skirt and heels. I was slowly easing into the situation before I found a place of comfort. Lilith relayed a quick set of ground rules for private room conduct, none of which I believed I would have trouble abiding by. Sensing my tension, the girl started off slowly dancing around where I sat. She circled around the chair, gently grazed against my arms and legs, and even emitted low moans of pleasure. Before long, the girl became more intense in her showcase. Dancing turned to groping against my legs and chest. I felt her fingers aggressively scanning all over my body. I wanted to leave more than anything in the world at that moment, but my body wouldn't let me. Soon after, Lilith began taking off her clothes. Stripping down to her lace and nearly transparent intimates, it was clear to see just why my body wasn't letting me leave. However, this still didn't change my mind telling me to do so. The girl continued her groping and straddling me around the waist, caressing my chest and shoulders. A tidal wave of conflicting feelings and thoughts raced through my mind as the treatment continued. Lilith then began lifting my shirt up over my head before unbuckling my belt. Trapped with a hypnotic anxiety-induced state of paralysis, I involuntarily allowed the girl to remove my clothes down to my boxers. She continued to dance on top of me, making flattering, if invasive, comments about my body. I knew that I was no longer enjoying myself, but my body remained in that chair. The dance continued until the dancer removed what was left of her clothing. My eyes, enchanted by her figure, remained on the woman. That performer was one of the most beautiful creatures that I'd ever encountered before. Lilith then walked around the back of the chair and brought my arms up behind me. She began tying me to the chair by my wrists. She came right up by my ear and shushed, trying to calm my nerves as she had firmly tied me into place. I pulled at the binds, but to my horror, I was effectively strapped to that chair. The dancer smiled and giggled as she watched my fruitless pull against the restraint. Up until that point, I was completely in the dark about the customs of private strip shows, but I knew that this was crossing the line. My body had finally caught up to where my mind had been from the start. I pulled at the bindings behind me to no success. I screamed and screamed, but no one came. Lilith looked down at me and commented on how the real strip show was just beginning. Before I could venture a guess at what she meant, the dancer climbed on top of my waist. I looked up to see a blank, apathetic expression washed across her face. Staring down at me, however, were eyes dark and brimming with sinister intent. Lilith inserted her long-nailed fingers into the side of her breast. She took a handful of pale skin in her fist. I watched as Lilith ripped a considerable strip of flesh from her body as effortlessly as she removed her clothes. Blood rained down on my body as it coursed from her open chest. The sight of the streaming blood was only as haunting as the sound of her skin as it tore from her body like paper. I sat face drained of warmth and eyes wide with shock at the spectacle before me. I screamed and screamed into the cloth, but once again no one else came to see what I was forced to see. Lilith then, in a similar fashion, began tearing off skin around her face. I remember brief glances of two eyeballs staring back at me out of a bloody mound of bone and torn muscle. Strip by strip, I witnessed the girl peel away her skin without a single pause or cringe from the pain. Her whole scalp peeled away in one piece, with her hair still attached. The whitened cap splashed onto the bloody ground below in a limp plop. Blood poured onto the floor in a constant stream. Lilith did not appear to be in any sort of agony from her self-mutilation. Instead, she relished in the experience as one would a hot bath after a long day. Underneath her skin was a gruesome display of pulsing muscle tissue. Blood began pooling onto the floor. More of it than I would have thought a single person could hold. And yet the girl continued dancing and shedding her skin. When she finished, a bloody figure of exposed muscle straddled across me. Not an inch of skin left on her dripping body. My voice had begun to fade from the amount of screaming I had done. I felt her blood splashed onto my body as I lay trapped underneath the girl. Wide eyes stared down at me, above 2 full rows of teeth. I wanted to wake up. I wanted it all just to be a really bad nightmare and wake up, but alas, what the creature did next was beyond real. I felt her bony fingers begin digging into my own bare chest. I let out a cry of anguish and pulled as hard as I could at the cords in which held up my arms. My eyes shut from the horror. I felt the warm, slithery muscle tissue of its skinless legs pressed against my sides. I could feel my skin breaking and bleeding as the demon dug like a rabid animal in my chest. Pulling harder and harder against my bindings, I eventually broke myself free. In one red blur, I pushed the figure aside and ran out of the room. I did not know the extent to which she had bore into me, but at that point, I didn't care. My main goal was to find my friends and get out as soon as I could. However, when I left the room and walked out into the main theatre, that was when I saw it. The single image that stood out above all of the others that night, and the one memory that I know I will always see when I close my eyes. The room was dead silent. The booming music which once blared over any possible conversation was replaced by near-perfect silence. I tried to call out to my friends, but my voice was completely gone. A dense blackness surrounded almost every side of me, save for a single blinding spotlight that shined in my direction from the main stage. I looked over to it, my eyes squinted as they adjusted to the brightness. Through the light, I saw 2 dark shadows gently swaying back and forth to no music. As I continued to look into the light, the shadows on top of the stage became clearer figures. 2 familiar silhouettes danced slowly, one tall and the other wide. Neither of them spoke, but both appeared to be looking in my direction. The stench of copper filled my lungs. They swayed their twitching dance as they dripped thick droplets onto the stage below. In the audience sat the remaining women of the club, cheering the performers on, cackling and throwing back the cash that they had been presented with earlier. I scrambled for the door in the pitch black, and only by the grace of God did I find it. After I was hit by that first blast of fresh cool night air, I ran. I ran as far as my legs would let me. I didn't even want to go home. I wanted to get as far away from the club as I possibly could. I knew I probably should have gone to the hospital or the police, but at that point my only priority was distance. I've not seen my friends again after that night. As of right now, it's still a missing persons case. I've repeatedly told the police where I last saw them and stand by my testimony. I know what I saw that night. I don't care what their investigations report. The strip club, Red Fantasy, does exist. I know it does. Do you believe in ghosts? If you do not, you may as well leave now. You'll find no interest here. If, like me, however, you keep an open mind, then you'll be interested to know that ghosts do exist. And I know this because I've seen them with my own eyes. Now, bear with me for a second. When I use the word ghost, I don't mean in the traditional sense you're probably thinking of, but for those of you that have done your research and know your stuff, then you'll know of the footprint on the beach theory that certain events in history can be so traumatic that they imprint themselves on the timeline itself. What you may not know, however, is that this theory originated in a small area in France, the only known location of such an event taking place. If you wish to see the shadows dance, you will have to travel to the small city of Crecy in northern France. When there, you may hear of the famous historical battle that took place near the town, where the English decimated a French army of around 30,000 men. If you can speak French, you may even find someone kind enough to direct you to the site of the battle, about a mile outside Crecy. In the rocky hillside at the edge of the road, you'll find a medieval wooden watchtower with 3 tiers overlooking a vast open field. It is a pleasant enough tourist attraction, with a bench to sit on and an information board written in both English and French. And if you happen to go there in the evening, you'll be treated to a beautiful sunset, best seen from the top of the tower. If history doesn't interest you, however, and you go there seeking something more, follow these instructions. Bring a flashlight and a camera if you wish to, and go to the watchtower on the first day of a new moon. It is advised to arrive there before sunset, as the road can be perilous in the pitch black. Feel free to explore the area, but once the sun has gone down, climb to the highest tier of the watchtower and stay there. It's safer that way. Have your flashlight and camera ready, or you may be in for a wait, because although the exact time cannot be determined, and seems to differ from person to person, it will always take place on that one day of the month, somewhere between 11 PM and 11 AM, and lasting exactly 1 hour. You will know when it has begun. When you begin to hear noises from the field below, that seem to be coming from the distance, but at the same time only a few meters away. The most common sounds that can be heard are the screams of men, hundreds of them all at once, and although they'll be little more than whispers, the pain and terror in those multitude of voices will be evident. Other sounds that can be heard include the clang of metal on metal, the galloping of horses' hooves, the crackle of flames, and the ripping of cloth. All of it barely audible through the utter darkness. If you soil your pants at this point, and do not wish to continue, which is understandable, put your flashlight away, sit down and stay there until morning. Do not, whatever you do, leave the confines of the watchtower. But if you do wish to see more, then switch on your flashlight and shine it over the field beyond, and you will see the shadows dance. In your beam of light, you'll be able to see them against the ground, a countless number of them, stretching the entire length of the field, no two alike and constantly shifting. They will be the shadows of men, grappling and wrestling in the dark, some tall, some short, some missing limbs, and some even missing their heads. Just watch them dance, and listen. Some claim to have heard the shadows speak actual words, some in French, some in English, though in the 3 times I've yet to hear it for myself. If you have brought a camera, or video camera, feel free to begin documenting, though try not to be disappointed with the results. You're taping shadows after all, what did you expect? Once the hour is up, this strange phenomenon will end as quickly as it began. Though just to be safe, stay up there in the watchtower until sunrise. Those who do not are found the following morning, their bodies broken and mutilated, with expressions of pain and terror etched across their face. During the summer of 2003, events in the northeastern United States involving a strange human-like creature sparkled brief local media interest before an apparent blackout was enacted. Little or no information was left intact, as most online and written accounts of the creature were mysteriously destroyed. Primarily focused in rural New York State and once found in Idaho, self-proclaimed witnesses told stories of their encounters with a creature of unknown origin. Emotions ranged from extremely traumatic levels of fright and discomfort to an almost childlike sense of playfulness and curiosity. While their published versions are no longer on record, the memories remain powerful. Several of the involved parties began looking for answers that year. In early 2006, the collaboration had accumulated nearly 24 documents dating between the 12th century and the present day, spanning 4 continents. In almost all cases, the stories were identical. I've been in contact with a member of this group and was able to get some excerpts from their upcoming book. A Suicide Note, 1964. As I prepare to take my life, I feel it necessary to assuage any guilt or pain I have introduced through this act. It is not the fault of anyone other than him. For once I awoke and felt his presence, and once I awoke and saw his form. Once again I awoke and heard his voice and looked into his eyes. I cannot sleep without fear of what I might next awake to experience. I cannot ever wake. Goodbye. Found in the same wooden box were 2 empty envelopes addressed to William and Rose, and 1 loose personal letter with no envelope. Dearest Linny, I have prayed for you. He spoke your name. A journal entry translated from Spanish, 1880. I have experienced the greatest terror. I have experienced the greatest terror. I have experienced the greatest terror. I see his eyes when I close mine. They are hollow, black. They saw me and pierced me. His wet hand. I will not sleep. His voice. From a Witness, 2006. 3 years ago, I had just returned from a trip to Niagara Falls with my family for the 4th of July. We were all very exhausted after a long day of driving, so my husband and I put the kids right to bed and called it a night. At about 4 AM, I woke up thinking my husband had gotten up to use the restroom. I used the moment to steal back the sheets, only to wake him in the process. I apologized and told him I thought he'd got out of bed. When he turned to face me, he gasped and pulled his feet up from the end of the bed so quickly his knee almost knocked me out of the bed. He then grabbed me and said nothing. After adjusting to the dark for half a second, I was able to see what caused the strange reaction. At the foot of the bed, sitting facing away from us, there was what appeared to be a naked man, or a large hairless dog of some sort. Its body position was disturbing and unnatural, as if it had been hit by a car or something. For some reason, I was not instantly frightened by it, but more concerned as to its condition. At this point, I was somewhat under the assumption that we were supposed to help him. My husband was peering over his arm and knee, tucked into the fetal position, occasionally glancing at me before returning to the creature. In a flurry of motion, the creature scrambled around the side of the bed, and then crawled quickly in a flailing sort of motion right along the bed until it was less than a foot from my husband's face. The creature was completely silent for about 30 seconds, or probably closer to 5. It just seemed like a while, just looking at my husband. The creature then placed its hand on his knee and ran into the hallway leading to the kids' rooms. I screamed and ran for the light switch, planning to stop him before he hurt my children. When I got to the hallway, the light from the bedroom was enough to see it crouching, hunched over about 20 feet away. He turned around and looked directly at me, covered in blood. I flipped the switch on the wall and saw my daughter Clara. The creature ran down the stairs while my husband and I rushed to help our daughter. She was very badly injured and spoke only once more in her short life. She said, "He is the rake." My husband drove his car into a lake that night while rushing our daughter to the hospital. They didn't survive. Being a small town, news got around pretty quickly. The police were helpful at first, and the local newspaper took a lot of interest as well. However, the story was never published, and the local television news never followed up either. For several months, my son Justin and I stayed in a hotel near my parents' house. After we decided to return home, I began looking for answers myself. I eventually located a man in the next town over who had a similar story. We got in contact and began talking about our experiences. He knew of 2 other people in New York who had seen the creature we now refer to as the Rake. It took the 4 of us about 2 solid years of hunting on the internet and writing letters to come up with a small collection of what we believed to be accounts of the Rake. None of them gave any details, history or follow-up. One journal had an entry involving the creature in its first 3 pages, and never mentioned it again. A ship's log explained nothing of the encounter, saying that they were only told to leave by the Rake. That was the last entry in the log. There were, however, many instances where the creature's visit was one of a series of visits with the same person. Multiple people also mentioned being spoken to, my daughter included. This led us to wonder if the Rake had visited any of us before our last encounter. I set up a digital recorder near my bed and left it running all night, every night for 2 weeks. I would tediously scan through the sounds of me rolling around in my bed each day when I woke up. By the end of the 2nd week, I was quite used to the occasional sound of sleep while blurring through the recordings. On the first day of the 3rd week, I thought I heard something different. What I found was a shrill voice. It was the Rake. I can't listen to it long enough to even begin to transcribe it. I haven't let anyone listen to it yet. All I know is that I've heard it before, and now I believe that it spoke when it was sitting in front of my husband. I don't remember hearing anything at the time, but for some reason, the voice on the recorder immediately brings me back to that moment. The thoughts that must have gone through my daughter's head made me very upset. I have not seen the rake since he ruined my life, but I know that he has been in my room while I slept. I know and fear that one night I'll wake up seeing him staring at me. Ted had been walking for what felt like an eternity. The glacial winds whipped around his face, chilling him to the bone. The leathers that once kept him warm served no more than dead weight, the frigid air seeping into the rips and the holes in his clothes. His hair and body were caked in a thin dusting of snow, fresh from the blizzard that encased him still. Ted could hardly see his own two hands. He had to squint his eyes in order to block out the relentless winds of the storm. He couldn't go back to his village now. Too many wrongs had been committed. Too many deeds left unpunished. And yet, these barren plains of ice held no more for him than the gallows did. He slumped onto his hands and knees, quaking and trembling as the snow filled his gloves. Ted knew that crying wouldn't end his pain, but judgment had been long thrown out the window. Suddenly, as the gloom of the emptiness flooded his mind, dread began to set in. The worst dread of all. Dread of death. This fear is so intense, so humbling, even the greatest of leaders kneel before it. He sobbed and shook, wondering how it had come to this. Ted craned his head skywards, pleading to God to save him from his agony. The thought then made him chuckle a bit, despite the fact that he was on the brink of death. Who would ever want to save a wretch like me? He shook his head, staring aimlessly off into the distance. Blinking away the tears, he noticed a faint but still ever-present glow of light. The thought that it could simply be a hallucination crossed his mind, although it was enough to keep on going. Wearily he got up, shivering as a small patch of snow slid down his shirt. Ted began walking towards the glimmer of light, his pace progressively increasing as the glow shone brighter. Soon enough he was sprinting, mind repeating the same words over and over again. Moving. I must keep moving. Sleep deprived and starving, he pressed forward, trudging through the snow. At last, after many grueling strides, he reached his salvation. It was a weathered away cottage, wood dry and creaking. Ted noticed the blizzard scarcely blew here, although he hardly thought a second of it. The windowsill had a thin pile of snow atop them, long icicles run down beneath them. Grey shingles lined the roof, barely visible underneath all the snow. It appeared to be a two-story getaway. Even though it was dark out, the sun shrouded by the blizzard, it seemed cheery enough to be hospitable. The house was completely lit upon the inside. It was nothing short of a miracle that he saw the weak glow. He giddily approached the doorway, and its arch similarly topped with snow. He rapped hard on the knocker, a sculpture of some deer of sorts. A stag, he thought. Ted heard no reply. He rapped again, harder than before. Still no response. Hello? Anyone in there? The house remained silent and unmoving. I'm coming in, he yelled, shivering, no longer wanting to spend another minute in the unforgiving conditions of the Arctic tundra. He would rather be pressed for another crime than freeze to death out here. He tried the doorknob, locked, as he expected. Reluctantly, Ted walked around the cottage, looking for some other means of entry. At the far back of the house, he found a hard metal door, an entrance to the basement perhaps. Once again, the handle was locked. Frustrated at himself for believing that this could have been his last hope for survival, he kicked the door, causing a cascading pile of snow to fall, shaken from the wall. In his anger, he almost missed a small trash can beside the door, partially sunken into the thick snow. Eager for even a minute amount of sustenance, Ted reached for the lid of the aluminium bin. Just as he was doing so, he heard the hazy sound of a door creaking. He withdrew his hand and cautiously moved his gaze towards the basement door. It was, of course, still closed, but this opened his mind to the conclusion that the front door had been unlocked. Brain overridden by the thought of contact with another human being, he ignored his insatiable hunger and rushed to the front door. It was open, but only a tad. Ted excitedly opened the door, hoping to finally see another person. He was greeted by the silence of an empty room, an antique rug patterned with reindeer and evergreen trees. In the far right corner sat a rocking chair, accented by dollies and silks. Along the wall in front of him were shelves, stacked with snow globes and other knickknacks. A fire burned fiercely in the hearth, warming Ted deeply. He let out a sigh of relief as he slumped against the drawer, closing the door and secluding himself from the brutal winds. He sat there in the eerie silence for a moment, allowing himself to warm up a bit. After breathing in the heat, he rose to find the owner who so graciously permitted him to enter. "Hello? Hello?" he boomed. Ted thought to himself that he had simply not tried the door enough and it was merely stuck. Confident with his explanation, he sought to find out what else was hidden within the cottage. Without the consolation of the fire, lanterns were required to light the kitchen space. The floor was polished checkerboard tile, and like the rest of the house, very dusty. He eagerly opened the cabinets that lined the upper edges of the room and the floor adjacent to the wall, longing for some nourishment. Sadly, all that occupied the cupboards were a healthy serving of dust and cobwebs. Not even a morsel of food remained. Disappointed, Ted explored what little was left of the first floor. He found nothing of significant use, only a vast expanse of antiques. Leading back into the kitchen, he sighted a door of a pantry of sorts. Once opened, it exposed that it was not a pantry, but in fact a stairwell. He gradually climbed the stairs, clinging to the rails for support. The stairwell joined the first floor with what appeared to be a hallway. Of course, this was only his speculation. There were absolutely no sources of light at the top of the stairs, leaving his surroundings in obscurity. He fumbled about the wall like a newborn babe, desperately combing for a door or anything really. He reached the end of the hallway at last, finding it was simply a dead end. It vexed Ted that they would build a house with a stairwell/hallway that led to absolutely nowhere. In the midst of the gloom, he disconcertedly looked for some kind of exit. He glimpsed a small glimmer of light. He blindly grasped at the shard of light, rushing to seize it before it vanished. His gloved hand closed around a minuscule sphere, and upon tugging it, realized it was attached to a string. He pulled down, revealing a small trapdoor, connecting to what he assumed to be the attic. Small rays of light protruded from the crevice in between the ladder and the ceiling. He stood back and dragged down harder. The ladder clanged against the ground with an echoing thud. The light almost blinded him, being in the pitch black for so long. As the house breathed its last groan, Ted was drowned in an unnatural quiet. Suddenly, the comforting cottage became much less consoling. With no other place but to go back, he hesitantly climbed the rungs. The attic space was claustrophobic. The slanted ceiling left very little room for any movement, so upon entering the cramped space, he wasn't surprised to find very little. He spied an open secretary in the far right corner beside the ventilation. On it were a few needles, some string, unfinished dolls, and other sewing crafts. To his left was a bed, covers left undone, as if someone had been inside the room not too long ago. The whispering wind slithered through the gaps in the ventilation, giving him shivers. The attic unnerved him, not only because of the bed, but the rest of the cottage's abnormal feel. The creaking door, the dead-end hallway, and the unsettling ambience. Having limited points of exit made it all the more discomforting. Still on edge, Ted panicked as a loud creak resounded through the room. Frantically, he scanned the surrounding area. He exhaled in relief, seeing not a hair out of place. Paranoia was at last beginning to weave its way into his system. "I'll stay here only as long as I have to," he decided. Remembering his crimes and having left the village, he added, "although perhaps longer than I anticipate." With cat-like reflexes, he slapped at the object that fell upon his neck. It was merely his own sweat, or possibly melted snow off his hat, although he quickly realized it was a constant drip, just like a little roof leakage. That's all, he reasoned. Ted gulped heavily as he heard breathing that was not his own. Slowly, he craned his head upwards. He was immediately gripped by an overwhelming state of shock, rooting him on the spot. Not more than 10 feet above him lingered an atrocity that can only be described as surreal. A human clung to the ceiling in a spider-esque fashion. It was dressed in worn, tattered leather moccasins and sagging breeches in cobalt colour. It was topped with a tan sweater with vertical stripes. Ted could only imagine what lurked beneath the burlap sack that shielded its face. Only a small opening allowed the saliva to drip onto his neck. The only visible portions of the being were its hands, its awful, cold, dead-looking hands. Almost as if frostbitten, they appeared in a pale blue tone, and to each finger was tied a 6-inch long sewing needle. Ted took short, quiet breaths, as not to alert the fiend. However, he knew, deep in the recess of his frantic mind, that it was already aware of his presence. A long shiver ran up his spine, like the flames of a burning rope. His eyes bulged, threatening to leave their sockets. He gulped hard, trying to futilely force his saliva past the lump in his throat that was his heart. The beast repeated over and over in a slow, raspy, monotone voice, "I want your face." The solemn but menacing words broke Ted's trance like a stone-piercing glass. He let loose a blood-curdling scream as he stumbled down the ladder. He fell, striking the wooden floors hard, leaving splinters in the palm of his hands. He raced blindly through the endless hallway, putting as much distance as he could between himself and the creature. Close behind, he could hear the god-awful sound of needles click-clacking along the walls, and now shrill, fast-paced repetition of disturbing words. Ted flew down the stairwell, practically bashing the door open. Childlike fears overwhelmed him, causing him to take shelter in an empty cabinet. He cursed himself, realizing the foolish decision that he had made. It was too late to turn back now. All he could do was remain as quiet as possible. His breaths were rapid, and he trembled uncontrollably. He sat in the fetal position with the final cabinets along the row. Ted could hear the monstrosity slowly open the door, soft footsteps following shortly after. He flinched as he heard a cabinet door bang forcefully against the wall. It was only a matter of time before it found him. Such a beautiful face. No need to hide it. Furious beads of sweat rolled down his forehead as the next door was thrown open. Only 3 more to go, he thought woefully. The third one opened with less intensity than the ones previous. God save me. The 4th door swung open. Ted could almost hear his breathing right beside his head. Cabinets being connected and whatnot. Tightly, he closed his eyes, too frightened to look. He braced himself for the impact, accepting his death as karma for his wrongdoings. God may yet have had mercy on him. The thing's shadow disappeared, walking away in the opposite direction in search of its lost prey. He waited several minutes to be certain it had truly gone, before hastily fleeing his refuge. He quickly flung open his wooden cage, hoping to escape before the thing could reach him. Just moments after leaving the cabinet, Ted screamed in excruciating pain as the creature dropped from the ceiling, clutching him on the shoulders. The needles pierced deep, scraping the bone. Reeling in agony, he wrenched the sack from its skull. Immediately, he wished he hadn't. Beneath the burlap was a hideous bald figure. Like the grisly hands, its head was pale blue, as if left in the snow for a week. Both ears and nose appeared non-existent, nothing more than hollow caverns, but the most gruesome feature was its eyes. Both were stitched completely shut. Even skin had begun to regrow over them. Its mouth was also stitched, but with thicker strands and more crosshatches. Only a small portion was torn, allowing for its sickening words to drift through. "Give me your face!" it screeched, deafening his ears momentarily. Exhausting all the energy that he could muster, Ted pulled free from its hold. Long lines of warm blood trickled down his arms and sleeves as he raced through the entryway, not caring where he went, so long as it was far away from that lonely cottage in the snow. However, as he ran across the plains, it simply stood in the doorway smiling. Suspended between 2 needled fingers about chest high was a rapidly spinning spool of red thread that trailed far out into the distance of the direction of Ted. The needle on its left ring finger was missing. Stitcher always gets its prey.